All right, we're live. Dave, it's good to see you again.
Thank you. You too.
I'm looking forward to this. We've been talking every couple years, and I would love to just keep the trend going. It's always wonderful to talk to you. I'll fill people in a little bit on the context of our last conversation. So we talked for the first time, I think around episode 50 or 55. You were one of my early guests. That was a massively popular episode. In that one, we really focused on two things: how you went from 8B to 9A, that big breakthrough that you had in your climbing after many years of climbing. We talked about that. We talked about fingerboarding with that quite a bit. And then we talked about nutrient density. Those are the two main themes in that episode. And then we did a follow up that's available on Patreon about a year and a half ago. And I was re listening to that one this morning. It's really fun to revisit that. But in that one, we talked about some of your ongoing diet experiments. We talked about the McDonald's experiment that you did, just eating McDonald's patties for 2 months. We had a pretty long conversation about LDL cholesterol. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I want to double click on that later today and
Mm.
ask about a follow up study that you sent me that was really interesting. And then we talked about writing your new book, which is now available. So I'm really excited to just continue the conversation and pick up more or less where we left off and hear how the last year and a half have been for you. But so themes for today's episode, I want to talk about your new book. Like I said,
Yep.
I want to talk about LDL a little bit and keto and any experiments that you've continued to do. I want to ask you about fruit and
Yep.
about Paul Saladino and kind of the
Oh yeah.
fruit meat sort of approach, because that's something that I'm trying for my psoriasis, and that's been interesting. And
Hmm.
then finally, I want to talk to you about aging, how your habits have changed as you've gotten older, your
Hmm.
climbing and training habits, lifestyle habits, and family time, and just living a rich and balanced life. And then if you have any advice for those of us that want to keep climbing as hard as you are later into our climbing careers. So yeah, that's the outline for folks. I'm
Oh,
sure
sounds
we'll.
exciting.
All right, yeah, I'm sure we'll go off the cuff and just riff and go all sorts of places as well. But so your new book, I want to start with that. Moving the Needle. The subtitle is How an Average Climber Can Do the Hardest Route in the World,
Hmm.
talking about Rhapsody, the first E11, the hardest trad route in the world at the time. I wanted to start by asking simply, what made you want to write this book? Because you've talked pretty extensively about that theme, that topic, like how you've, progressed so much as a climber. You touched on some of those points in 9 out of 10 Climbers, your first book. You've talked about it a lot on your blog, on podcasts like the one we did, the first time around. You've done pretty long YouTube videos about how you've progressed in your own climbing.
Hmm.
So, yeah, what was missing that made you want to do a whole book on this topic?
I think it was interacting with people on social media that gave me the spark of an idea that there's a book that would be interesting to write. So um, one of the things is I actually started writing about my own climbing on a blog after I actually did Rhapsody. So I'd
Okay.
already done like the hardest trad route in the world at the time, um, in 2006, and it was only after that that I started writing about it, and I have been ever since, and that's been a long time, like nearly 20 years. But and I've written and then made videos, and I've always tried to show my working as I'm going along, talking about the challenges that I'm facing in my personal climbing and how I'm applying either science or trial and error to figure things out and move forward. Um, but over the past couple of years, there's a couple of things. One is the trend, especially on YouTube, of the notion that you can solve a lot of these problems, make progress, make big progress on things very quickly. You if you follow climbing on YouTube, you'll see like learn a one arm pull up in 30 days. Learn this in a very short time period. And I've kind of done that a little bit myself. I mean, you mentioned a moment ago a video I made about going from 8B plus to 9A in a quite a short time period. And so I kind of done that as well, but the content of that video made a really important point, which is easily lost, which is that only worked for me because I had this long apprenticeship of building up movement technique for a long time. So therefore, every kilo of force that I could gain in my finger strength goes a lot further if you already have good technique. So I tried to say that if you did the same and you had the same strength gain, if you didn't have that basis of technique to go with it, it wouldn't have the same leverage. So I do think that the discourse on training for climbing is kind of has moved a wee bit in that direction of thinking of like, yeah, we can learn all these skills really quickly. And there's a lot of content as well for relatively new climbers. I guess there is a big influx of climbers going to bouldering walls, trying climbing for the first time, and a lot of people trying to get up to V6, V7 as quickly as they can. Um, and possibly they'll use some shortcuts to do that, things that have a good bang for your buck in the short term. And so what I wanted to do was make a book that's sort of like um, an ode to an old school climbing apprenticeship, which is long and complicated and has lots of setbacks and lots of boring stuff. Um, the incremental gains that are slow to come, but allow you to get to a really high level.
Mm.
And the other thing was that um, I'm in this weird position. So I'm like 46, and like like many people, I've got some battle scars from my climbing. Yesterday, I was trying a new route on Ben Nevis, and today I've been like hobbling around the house because like got sore ankles and like problems with my toes, and I could like sort of hobbling down the stairs in the morning. I can still climb hard, um, but I don't feel like this super athlete a lot of the time, even though I still can, make it work in climbing really well. But I get this sense of people often say it like in comments, "Oh, it's different for you, Dave. You're a pro. You're a professional climber." Um, and so almost like there's different rules that apply. And I do feel that it's sort of underappreciated the length um, and intensity of my own apprenticeship. And so I just wanted to write a story about those early years, but before 2006, before I actually started writing about climbing, because I hadn't really explored that in detail and gone through all of the pieces of good fortune, or in some cases, decisions that I made that were quite good, or in some cases, it was things that I stumbled into, but I was good. I was sensible enough to realize that, oh, I'm onto something here. I'll stick with this. So I wanted to lay out all those things and explain why they allowed me to overtake a lot of the people I climbed with who were much better than me. I wasn't even close to being the best climber in my local climbing wall for many years. And it was only quite laterally after climbing for, 7, 8, 9 years that I started to go on a steeper upward trajectory and make a lot more progress and start to catch up with my peers locally in Glasgow and then overtake some of them.
Hmm.
So I just wanted to go through all of those things.
Yeah. I mean, you wrote a whole book on this, so there's obviously a lot here, and I don't want you to give away all your, all the things that make the book worth buying. Obviously, people should just go buy the book if they want the whole story, but I can't help myself. I need to ask about some of these things.
Oh yeah.
What did you do different than those friends? I mean, obviously, yeah, like I said, this is a whole book. There's a lot here, but the people that fell off over the years,
hmm
what did they, where was the fork in the road? Where did they go right
Mm.
where you went left? What are some of the things that come to mind? Is it just consistency? Is it, yeah, what else is in the mix
Well,
there?
consistency, but I always try to, with these things, I always try to go upstream and think like, where did consistency is the most important thing in training, but where does the consistency come from? Why are some people consistent with their effort and focus and some aren't? So I suppose I could start with what I feel like was the one massive asset or strength that I felt like I was handed before I even started climbing, which is just curiosity. Um, and I do think that curiosity is something that's both trainable, and it's something you can choose to have. So in my book, I had this analogy that, and as we go through life, we come across lots of things that could potentially grab our interest. For both you and I, for various reasons, for health reasons, we've been sort of interested in nutrition. And so something that you maybe didn't think about for years and years, all of a sudden you start to dive down this rabbit hole, and the next thing you're thinking, all of a sudden you know all about lipoproteins and and blood chemistry and things like that. And you think, how did I get here? Like researching papers on LDL, when I was just interested in climbing. So, you know, interest in life can pull you down these rabbit holes, and there's a million things to be interested in. So I had this analogy of you pass across like the outer orbit of all these different interesting fields, and if there's something that draws you just slightly in to that gravity, if you like, you get pulled in. And I feel that I'm sort of naturally quite good at that. And so the thing that got me interested was how to do moves. I was just curious about how to do moves, and that tendency interacted with my environment. Like all these things are often two or three ingredients that interact together, and it's the combination of them that's really powerful. So I started climbing at Dumbarton Rock, which is a slightly unusual rock type. It's basalt, and it's very angular and featured, very different from limestone or granite. And it's quite smooth and polished. It doesn't have a great deal of friction. Um, so there's lots of options for how to do moves. There's lots of footholds, but often they're not very helpful, and there's a lot of subtlety in the movement. But it tends to the climbs tend to yield to having a curious approach. If you keep digging into the details of sequences, you can usually find solutions that allow you to get further on a move or a climb, without increasing your strength. And so I just found that really rewarding. I think I got that natural curiosity from my mum. She's always been like that, and it's almost like a running joke in our family. Is like, if there's something that's needs to be kind of understood, some complex issue, if you just kind of ask my mum, she'll just go off on this rabbit hole, and 3 months later she'll come back and she'll have learned as much as any expert about it. And I think I sort of got that as well, and I kind of directed that towards moves and climbing, and just that together with Dumbarton Rock allowed me to just enjoy that more and more. The more I did it, the more I did bouldering at Dumbarton, the more I just thought, if I just keep trying these alternatives, I will make progress. And then I enjoyed it when I did. And that just kept, that's like a snowball effect.
Mm.
And I describe in the book actually climbing somewhere else on a winter route when I was still at school. I think I was 16, and I didn't have ice axes and crampons. And so I was trying to do these routes with one ice axe and no crampons. And I was kind of coming up against the limit of what you could climb on mixed and ice without spikes on your feet. And a friend was going on holiday, and he told me I could borrow his ice axes and crampons for 2 weekends. And on the first weekend, I went with a friend, and I took the opportunity to try a route a grade harder than I had been before. So it was my first time actually leading a mixed route. And I remember going up it, getting really, really scared, getting to the crux and going up and down several times, like really, really scared and pumped. And I was only had like a move to go to get to easier ground, but I just felt so out of my depth, and I backed off. And I remember like reversing down the pitch back to the ground and feeling like increasing relief as I kept climbing down. But the moment I stopped, took the last step into the snow at the base of the route, all the relief just disappeared, and I just have this really burning memory of walking back down our footsteps in the snow away from the route, having failed on it, and like the curiosity of how you would do that move at the high point. Just it reached a kind of point where it was like a burning need, and I just couldn't let it go. And I think that's the basis of the consistency, is to be driven by something. And people can be driven by all sorts of things. Some people can be driven by wanting to be famous or wanting to be the best in the sport or wanting to get to the Olympics or wanting to, they just have some specific goal, like I really want to climb V6 or something like that. But to me, it was just, I really want to figure out moves that I can't do. And the great thing about that goal is that it just keeps rolling over. It never ends. So that was the basis of consistency.
Mm.
And then as I progressed, I layered on top of that a few other good decisions. So at Dumbarton, I think there was around 80 boulder problems there when I started climbing, and there was more being done all the time. And so there was a lot to go at, and some of them were quite high ball, and some of them weren't done very often, usually because they were high, but some of them too, they were just technical as well. And I remember someone just saying in a just casual conversation, like there's no one person who's actually done all of them, even all the established climbs. And I remember thinking, oh, that if you did that, that would be a really good broad base. Like you would be a really well-rounded climber if you could do that. Because a lot of the ones that really got done weren't that hard. They were just high or technical or both. And so I started to do that. I set this rough goal of doing all of the boulder problems at that one crag. And then I layered on top another good decision, which was I I had a sort of strategy. I said like they're high ball, so a lot of them were too scary to just attack and just try and climb to the top. They were just pretty terrifying, really. So I just said, don't try and push yourself to go right out of your depth and then fall and break your ankle. Just try and do one little thing out of your comfort zone on every session. And
Mm.
if you don't lapse from that, you should make progress. And that simple decision was really good because I stuck to it. So there wasn't pressure to actually get higher on the climbs. Sometimes I just would go up to the high point and just say, just try and stay here for a few minutes before you climb back down. And the more I would do that, the more I would stay, and then I would find myself calming down. And then once I was calm after 2 or 3 minutes, I'd spot the next hold, or I suddenly see how to do the next move, and then it would just unfold. So things like that all made climbing really work for me.
Mm.
But I also had one or two pieces of pure good fortune. So one of them was the very first day I ever went climbing. I went to Dumbarton, and there was two climbers on a route called Requiem, which was the hardest rock climb in Scotland at the time, had been for like 10 years. So Requiem's an 80 plus trad route, and it was done in 1983 by Dave Cuthbertson. It was probably one of the first 80 pluses in the world.
Is that E9?
It's E8. It's
E8?
E8, yeah. It's
Okay.
well protected, well protected. But there was two climbers trying that route on a top rope the first day I went. So that was the first time I'd ever seen rock climbers, and they were just on this route. And I didn't know what the route was, but I just was really inspired seeing them. And I just, also by the line, I could see why they'd chosen that line, because it was the most striking, best line at the crag. So my naivety helped me to make this goal. I just said, whatever that climb is, I want to do that. And it was only afterwards that I found out that it was really hard. But although I found out that it was the hardest route in the country, and I was like, oh well, I'll never do that then. But it was because it was inspiration, like it was this little moment of inspiration. It was too late to kind of erase the thought. I'd already kind of identified with it. And so when I was on the boulders, like the Requiem literally towers over the boulders. So every time I was stood in front of a boulder and I was trying to work out moves, trying to push myself, I'd always like look up and see Requiem. And I just thought, if I don't get through this move on this little boulder, I'll never get to that. And it helped to keep up the pressure. So all these things were like catalysts, they all work together, I think.
Mm.
So that's a few examples of the things that I discuss in the book. They're all simple things, simple
Yeah.
decisions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm listening to you share all that, and I can see myself in some of them, and then I can see where I lost the plot hearing some of them as well, which is really interesting. Like I'm 35. I started climbing in 2007. Um, So yeah, 17 years ago. And I've had a somewhat similar approach to you in that I always really prioritized rock climbing. I didn't have great access to gyms, didn't have a home wall for a very long time. Really
Hmm.
just got a home wall. I had one in Oregon for a couple years, but never had like a board, just a basic steep board to train on or anything. Didn't know anything about hangboarding, but I was a completionist. Like I really wanted to check all the little boxes in the guidebook, and I would go do the
Hmm.
like 1 star V2 or the 1 star V4 or the really gnarly granite slab in Leavenworth, and just I wanted to do all these things. And then when I moved to Smith Rock, I had a very similar mindset. Like I want to do all the routes, you know. Of
Hmm.
course I didn't, but I did a lot of them. And you know, like one example of something I did really well, I think was I know a lot of people, a lot of friends that climbed at Smith for a long time, and it just so happens, you know, every area has different kind of grade densities, right, and different
Hmm.
grade gaps, and it just so happens that Smith Rock has a lot of 13As, 513As, or 7C pluses, but very few 512Ds, very few 7Cs
Yeah.
for some reason,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
but what's actually the reality is that there are very few classic 12Ds, but there are quite a few of them if you're willing to do like 1 star, 2 star routes and brush the cobwebs
Hmm.
off and sometimes reinforce some holds and things like that. And I was determined to maintain my pyramid, my climbing route pyramid shape. I was like, I'm going to have more 12Ds than 13As. And I sought all those 12Ds out and did as many of them as I could. And all of like most of them were 1 or 2 stars, kind of fucked up, like not very fun, not very pleasant to
Yeah.
climb, but maybe they had like a nasty, hard, like, you know, pocket boulder problem or something. And I learned a little bit from every one of them. And I think that helped me unlock, you know, the 513 Bs and Cs that were the classics that flowed a little better and just were higher quality routes. Um, there have also been times, you know, so like having that foundation and then building training on top of that is great. Like I got up to 513D mostly from just rock climbing.
Hmm.
Um, and it's hard to communicate that, like you've said, to the new generation where people have access to all these amazing gyms and spend most of their time inside, especially if they live in the city and whatnot. It's hard to get that same level of variety of movement and skill and different footholds and things. Um, so yeah, actually, let's stay on this. I have so many questions, but let's stay on this topic for a little bit. How do newer, younger climbers that have a great gym, that have a kilter board or a tension board or a moon board that they train on a lot, um, what advice do you have for people like that who are getting strong really quickly, who haven't had the time to develop all those movement skills and haven't had all the mileage on actual rock? Is there a way for like does it just come down to time and mileage? Do they just have to prioritize rock climbing and get out there to build those skills or
Yeah.
um yeah.
Time multiplied by mileage multiplied by variety, I would say. That would be the other part to it. That's one advantage I had purely from being in Scotland. Scotland is has one of the greatest variety of rock types and character of climbing in any single country that I know of. Um, so even within like an hour's drive of Glasgow, that the number of different rock types that you can climb on is just ridiculous. So variety is really important. So I suppose it's maybe slightly different for someone who's only climbing indoors versus outdoors. For someone climbing indoors, just getting to different climbing walls, just that alone. I mean, that's something where the architecture of your environment, um, you have to think like what influences are steering your training in a certain direction. I mean, for people who primarily climb indoors, a huge thing is memberships at their gym. I don't know if it's the same in the US, but certainly in the UK, it's very walls compete with each other on memberships, and the pricing is reflects that. So, you know, people want the climbing walls want to capture people and make that one climbing wall as their place where they go climbing. And that has its upsides. That means that you get to know people there and you make friends there. And that's all brilliant. But it can disincentivize you traveling around to different walls and experiencing um, different setting, different holds, seeing different climbers in action, and just a whole different scene. So for people at indoors, just going to different climbing walls and competing is a great way to introduce variety. For for people who climb outdoors, just getting out in the mountains. I mean, and so in my book, it's got a lot of pictures in it, and that was one of the things I just wanted to make a book that showed off all of the lovely places that you can go climbing.
Mm.
Not just for people who are actually based in my country, but just because like I just think looking at crags and mountains and routes is still one of the things that inspires me. And when I think of when I started climbing, it was the climbing magazines and the pictures that are there. It's a strange thing these days because we're obviously flooded with great pictures. Everyone's got a good digital camera in their pocket now, and Instagram has just like got millions of great pictures, but somehow they don't quite have the same impact for me, at least, as the climbing magazines did.
Yeah.
There's something about climbing magazines were quite special, and guidebooks as well. Um, and it really made me want to go to those places and experience those routes. Um, and so I wanted to make something that just motivated people to get out and see different places. So just doing that is really good. One of the chapters in my book, I talk about how I broke through a big plateau in my trad climbing. So we talked about rapid progression. So because I was bouldering a lot, I did gain strength. So by the time I was started climbing when I was 15, and by the time I was 18, 19, I th- I think I'd maybe done one or two V9s, but I was mainly kind of V8, V9 climber. Um, but I was still like my trad level was so low, like really, really low, like 5.5, 5.6, and I was really struggling because I just felt like I was soloing, and it kind of clicked how to trust gear. Um, and then I made a huge jump, and I remember on this one day, I did my first uh, hard VS E1, E2, E3, and E4 because it all just fell into place. It's like, oh,
Mm.
right, okay, that's a good wire. Like I can actually trust that, so I can move above it and I feel comfortable. And then I could use the physical strength that I already had. But then I wanted to keep that progression going, and that was a big mistake because I nearly got myself killed.
Oh.
Um, a, a few months after that. So I got to E4 and I did a couple more E4s. And then I was trying to do this E4 in Dumbarton, completely naive about conditions. So it was a really humid, hot evening. And I was climbing this route that hadn't been done for years and it was really mossy and it had poor protection. And my wife Claire was beeling me. And I put in this cam like below halfway up the pitch. And then I continued and put in these wires that weren't very good. And I knew they weren't very good. And I was saying to Claire, like, these are not very good. Continued on. And I was like almost getting over this crux bulge to the Beeley ledge, but just having to keep reversing and going back up. And at first I was like, I'll just go up a few more times and then I'll figure it out and I'll do it. But the more I went up, I didn't figure it out and I kept returning to this rest. But each time I was getting more and more tired until I realized like I'm not going up and I also can't climb down.
Oof.
Um, and it all got very stressful. And eventually I hung on until I couldn't hang on anymore. And just remember my fingers opening on these undercuts and peeling off. And I hit a 50-foot head first dive and all my wires all popped out. And Claire had watched with me more than once the movie Hard Grit. And at the start of that, she'd seen that sequence where the Belier sprints backwards and takes in the rope. So
Mm.
she had so much time to realize that I was going to take this nasty fall. And she just sprinted and then dived and she took in all the rope. And I just remember the rope coming tight and it's sort of swinging in this arc and the grass just took my hat off like that.
Oh,
So she absolutely saved my life. I would have just been headfirst into the ground.
wow.
Um, so that was I sort of realized there like, oh, I can't continue like this. you go back to square one, go back a bit. But I didn't really know how. But it was things that something by accident. A lot of these things were decisions that I stumbled into, and it was only with hindsight I realized that they were good for me. So the next thing I got a really bad pulley injury, and I was just desperate to keep climbing. And I had a partner who had a car, um, and he climbed VS, which is a much lower grade. And so I could climb VS even with my injured pulley because it was just easy climbing. So what I did was we just went out and did VSs, but we went out and did what you were describing, where we went to all of the scary, loose climbs in the guidebook. In the guidebooks in Scotland, they have a dagger against them if it's like a route that never gets done or it's known to be loose or dirty. And so we just did all those routes. And they were so much fun. It was like an acquired taste, but it was one of the most fun periods in my climbing.
Hmm.
And a lot of the weekends we went away, I forgot that I was actually injured because I was just looking forward
Hmm.
to having this mad adventure on some interesting terrain. But that's where I really learned to be a solid leader and have a cool head. So I was coming up against like, wet turf or really loose rock or just keeping on going where there's just no protection, but on easy terrain. And as as my finger healed, I worked back up through the grades. But doing again, I had that combination I was talking about of volume and variety, lots of routes in all these different contexts. And when I got back to E4, I just went right past it, and I was on sighting E5 and E6, and then on sighting my first E7 the following year. So I got up
Hmm.
to, I mean, E7 on site was the kind of limit at that time. Um, so that was something that only with hindsight I realized that getting injured was like the catalyst for. It was a really good thing that happened to me.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I have a similar experience. This is 6 or 7 years ago. I had my first bad pulley injury, and as I was recovering, I just made this spreadsheet of trad routes at Smith Rock that I wanted to do, and just same thing, completionist, like all the 510s and 11s, and did like 40 or 50 new pitches and onsighted most of them, and then later that summer on went back to sport climbing after my finger recovered and onsighted my first 4 or 5 12Cs, I think, and then my first
Yeah,
12B, just boom, boom, boom.
brilliant.
It's like, wow, I never thought that trad climbing and onsighting 510s would lead to me onsighting 12C on bolts.
Mhm.
I've thought about this a number of times because I've had that similar experience a couple times with injuries. Have you ever taken a bunch of steps back on purpose when you're not injured? Like if you're stuck at some kind of plateau or you're like beating your head against something, have you ever pretended you're injured almost and like taken a bunch of steps back and kind of done like a rebuild like that? Because I've thought to myself like, man, every time that is forced upon me, it leads to a great outcome. But I can never quite bring myself to do it aside from, maybe if I've taken like a week or two off over the holidays, maybe I'll ease back in. But it's usually pretty rushed. I'm psyched to get back to pulling hard. So I usually
Yeah,
just kind of fly right through that. But have you ever done that?
but mostly I haven't had to actually decide to do it. One of the great things about doing all the different climbing disciplines as a kind of all-rounder thing, it sort of forces it on you. So this year I've spent most of the year sport climbing and didn't do much trad. And like yesterday, I was just doing trying a new route on mixed terrain, and getting used to like three. I think I was like 3 hours on the lead on one pitch yesterday,
Wow.
um, and just going up and down and plugging away and probing and trying to get higher and just to
When you
that.
say mixed, it's mixed rock and ice, right? Not like
Yeah,
mixed
yeah,
trad and
yeah,
sport.
full
Because
on winter climbing.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay.
Um, so doing the different disciplines tends to help you to do that anyway. It takes you to new places. It forces you to climb with different partners. Often the people I would go sport climbing with might be different from the people I go winter climbing with. Um, and also the places are different and the rock types are different. So usually I don't need to decide to do that. But sometimes I have done, and often that's for the simple reason of too much projecting and not enough on-sighting.
Mm.
I love projecting routes. I love getting really into super hard projects, and I've done a lot of climbing, so I've got enough experience that I can get away with just projecting for quite a long time. But after a while, I do notice like, yeah, I could really do with like just a couple of weeks of pure on site on sport climbs just to get used to doing lots of moves and just reading sequences and being more intuitive with my climbing because I think you do forget to be kind of intuitive a little bit just to sharpen up on that side of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. That's a balance I've been struggling to find the last couple years. I've really immersed myself in bouldering since about, I don't know, since maybe September or October of 2022. That was my last big sport climbing trip, and I've kind of been
Mm-hmm.
all in on bouldering ever since, and I've been really trying to push my top level.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to do a balance of projecting and mixing in more volume, but yeah, there's this tough. I don't know. On one hand, like you have to put the time in. Like if I want to climb my first V12, I have to put the time in. But when I do go all in on a hard project, I'm 35 years old. I get tweaked more often these days, or it just doesn't work. I'll make progress, 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 and then feel like, okay, I've kind of exhausted the amount of progress I can make without going back to the drawing board a little bit and doing some training or doing some other climbing. So yeah, I've found that surprisingly hard actually to balance those two
Mm.
things, knowing when
Yeah.
to do more volume, knowing when to, really focus in on a project.
Yeah. I mean, to get around that, I think people just probably need to be um, a bit inventive and d based on what climbing areas or styles they have available to them. So one of the things I do, if I want to stay on that lane, if you like, of working on a hard project, and I don't want to distract myself with too many other things, and yeah, like you, and need to take rest days and recover and be sharp. I can still do easy soloing, and I think that for the on-sighting doesn't necessarily need to be hard. So soloing still feels challenging, even if it's easy, because it's solo. Um, so I find that works well for me for doing that. But
Okay.
yeah,
Interesting.
possibly some other people might have some other way to get around that. Yeah, maybe it's like just quite easy trad or something like, or just even a trip. I mean, usually like I found that when I've been projecting, um, you can lose fitness. You can actually lose fitness while you're in the middle of a hard boulder project or a sport project,
Yeah.
simply because you have to rest so much. Um, or there's a particular move that either um, hurts something, like it hurts a finger or a shoulder or something like that, or it just trashes your skin. Um, so sometimes in the middle of your project season, there's still no harm in just taking 2 weeks out and going on a sport trip and just going and on-sighting a bunch of 12Bs or something like that, and then coming back to it. You won't lose anything from the project, and you'll probably just feel good.
Mm,
I've done that a few times myself, and being like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I needed.
that's smart.
Yeah.
You don't stress. It sounds like you don't stress about trying to maintain, like you're not like hangboarding while you're doing those 2 weeks. You're just
No, no,
totally
you're
changing
not
things
going to
up.
lose. You're
Yeah,
not
yeah,
going to lose the strength in
yeah,
that time. Yeah, especially if you've been doing a lot of either hard bouldering or strength training. Let's say you've been doing that in a stint for many months. Taking a couple of weeks off is no big deal at all. You might even get stronger in the
hmm
process. Yeah, I mean, in my book, I was talking about the first time I ever got a pulley injury. I was like 16, and I was projecting a Font 7B V8 problem at Dumbarton, and then I had to take 4 months off um, because it was a particularly bad pulley injury, and I was just doing a little bit of pulling on small edges, actually in a tree in my garden, in my
Oh,
mum's garden. So I'd do these little boulder problems, and at first, like, um,
like crimping the
they were like,
bark or
yeah. So, well, there was like some branches, and then there was some branches that had been chopped off, and so they left these little kind of knobbles.
yeah.
and then I actually cut some holes in the bark, and when the bark was growing back, it made these like quite nice rounded edges.
I
It was a
love
big
it.
tree. Um, so it was almost like a cheat. Like I could get a little bit of climbing, and I used to do this every time I put the kettle on to make some tea. I'd like run out the back door and do one like 3 or 4 move problem. And at first it was really easy ones, and then I would gradually make them a little bit harder. And then they would still hurt my finger a little bit, but not bad, just very gently. Um, and I was thinking, oh, I'm just going to be losing all of my fitness. I'm going to have to start from square one. And I just never forget that finally thinking, actually, it's really strong now. I can really crimp on it and it's not sore. I think I'll go back to climbing now. I think it's safe. And I was being really conservative. Um, Went back to Dumbarton and I just did this V8 just first try, and it was just easy. And I realized I've actually got stronger in the
Wow.
layoff. And I was like, oh, this is
Wow.
brilliant. Yeah.
How long was that period? That layoff?
Like 4 months. Yeah, four
Wow.
months.
Just
Yeah.
tree crimping for four
Yeah.
months.
So I think I just totally underestimated because I was literally like I was in the time it took the kettle to boil. So I'd like run out, do like 4 moves, and then come back in. So maybe I don't know how many times I would do that in a day, but a handful of times every day.
Every day.
It didn't feel like I was training, but
Yeah.
I was clocking up mileage, and it was a perfect progression. Yeah, so it was actually like a better rehab than I could have imagined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So, how do you think about that these days? Because that's really interesting. It's obviously a very different protocol, but it has some similarities to when you first got into fingerboarding and I think you were writing a book and you were just, hey, people can go back and listen to our first episode if they want all the details. And you've done a great YouTube video on this as well. But um, you were hangboarding every single day or like 6 days a week. And then you were also going out and just doing these really long, easy traverse, well, easy
Yeah.
or sometimes kind of hard actually, traverse sessions, just getting a lot of mileage in and then going on runs. And you just did that like 6 days a week for months and
Yeah.
months. So how do you think there's like seemingly some magic to really high frequency loading on the fingers? There's quite a few examples of this in the climbing world. But obviously there's on the flip side, there's this totally different approach, which is, do something that's more maximal once or twice a week with a lot of consistency and then more easy climbing mixed in. How do you approach that these days? Do you have any sort of daily, whether it's, just kind of like a health promoting thing, like any sort of like a tonic for your fingers, so to speak, or um, do you settle into more just like doing some hangboarding on your hard bouldering days or like, yeah, have you like incorporated any kind of daily thing?
Almost daily. Almost daily. So um I do because I've got the board in my garage, I do like to have like proper sessions. So I don't tend to climb every day. I think my favorite routine is probably about 4 days a week if I'm only training. Um, the funny thing is though, in the past couple of years, I've really not trained that much because I've had some fantastic boulder projects. I've, through the winters, I've just gone bouldering and felt really good doing that. But when I'm on the board, I do like to. It's often like really cold in my garage, so it's better to actually have a full session. So if I just warm up, have a like an hour or two of hard bouldering, and then a fingerboard, and then do some endurance stuff, and then take a rest day. So I would maybe have like 2 days on, 1 day off, and then 1 day on, 1 day off, something like that. That works quite well. Um,
With a similar format every time?
Quite similar, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I just, I tend to hangboard every time I climb, more or less.
And it's not,
And
you
I'll
usually do
boulder.
the bouldering first and then the hangboarding.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly, yeah. But I think I can do that, because I'm like reasonably in shape. Some people might struggle with that. I think they might need to do the hangboard first. But it works fine for me doing that. One thing I sometimes do that again is similar to what we were just saying, and I don't really notice, I don't really think of it as training, but if I go out to my car or I go into the garage to like pack climbing gear for the next day to go out climbing, I'll just go on my 15-degree board in my trainers and just go around it a few times.
Hmm.
And I'll do that quite often. I don't really count it as a training session, but it's like, low intensity base endurance. It's just like moving around on holds. So it's just really like keeping consistency and pulling on holds as much as possible, really.
Hmm.
Um, but it's not super intense. Yeah. So I
Okay.
do do a fair bit of that. So, that all sounds fairly unplanned. A lot of my training is kind of unplanned. I try to just I try to just get the basics right and don't worry too much about the details. And part of the reason for that is because I still really like going out climbing on rock or ice right throughout the year. So like I say, the last couple of years, I've actually not done a huge amount of training at all. I've just gone climbing, and that's about it.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you have a unique situation because you climb in many different styles. You climb year round, and so you're always just kind of taking advantage of the weather when you can, and then fitting in training when you can.
Yeah, but I will say that I, I think that you do have to be careful. I have to be careful, and I think over the past 2 years, I think I have lost a little bit of upper body muscle mass,
Okay.
and I'm now thinking that I need to correct that. So I think in the coming year, I might try and plan in my training a bit more and focus on training a bit more to try and recover some of that. Uh, I can actually see it in my own videos. I'm like, yeah, I've got
Mm.
I've got less shoulder than I did like a couple of years ago, and
Okay.
on some moves I can kind of feel that a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. What do you consider the basics? You just said in your training you don't plan things too much. You just make sure you get the basics right. We're risking rehashing some trodden ground here that we've probably covered before, but yeah, what do you consider those basics to be?
Oh, I think it's never bad to reiterate the basics
Yeah, yeah,
because most
nice.
most training our errors are deviating from the basics on some
Mm,
level. Sometimes it's not obvious what the deviation is, but that's usually the problem. Well, I think the absolute fundamental is sleep, like good sleep, and so occasionally my schedule gets kind of busy, and sleep is in danger of becoming interrupted either no, I don't ever usually um, compromise going to bed time. I usually stick to that fairly well. Although, having said that, I do find that actually having a family routine is a big help to force me to go to bed early. And if my wife and my daughter are away and I'm just on my own, I do tend to go into a kind of overwork mode where I just go
mm,
completely crazy, and I could like work all night and just not stop. 'Cause I tend to be pretty motivated for projects, not just within my climbing, but whatever. I did that actually writing this book some of the time, where you just like keep going and keep going. Um, so I tend to go to bed at a reasonable time, but sometimes I work right up till the time I go to bed and then don't sleep all that well.
mm. Yeah,
And sometimes I'm not super disciplined with caffeine in the evening, especially if I'm driving home from the crag quite late. Um, and that definitely impacts my sleep. And then, like a lot of people, I'm not always super disciplined about not looking at bright screens late in the evening either.
yeah,
So sleep is a fundamental basic. Like, I think as most people get older, um, certainly in their 30s and definitely into their 40s, you just know that if you turn up for a training session after a poor sleep, it's not going to happen. So I
yeah,
see this curtail my training volume if I've not had a good sleep.
yeah.
Um,
Something I've noticed, you can kind of trick yourself because something I've noticed is I might have a bad night's sleep and then climb great the next day, but then I feel it the
mhm.
following day after that. Like there's kind of this
Yeah,
delayed effect sometimes.
yeah. So the sleep thing, if you have good sleep, that allows you to turn up for the start line turn up to your training session feeling good, feeling ready to actually pull hard. And that's the next basic, is actually pull damn hard on the holds. And that requires motivation. That requires being psyched. Um, and sometimes that takes a little bit of work. You might say it takes curating. Uh, you need to find the environment that makes you feel really driven and excited. For me, it's projecting hard boulders. That's what gets me really psyched, and I do notice it. It's like I was working on a boulder project for the last 3 winters, and that I just did in March, and it's a short walk to the boulder, and I wouldn't notice it while I was actually climbing, but when about 10 minutes after I stopped climbing, and you're packing up the mats and starting to walk back, that the sort of fatigue from the session would just hit me like a brick wall. And you realize how hard you've been trying. And then by the time you've got back to the car and start driving home, like you're like, oh my God, my arms and my forearms and my fingers are just absolutely crushed. So that tells you you've been really motivated and really pulling hard, and that's what you need to get strong.
Mm.
Um, so possibly it's trying really hard on real projects that will get you motivated. When I'm on at home on the garage, like I try to set good problems, and like good setting and good projects on my board help me to get psyched. For other people, like I train really well on my own, but some people benefit from training with other folk, and they bounce off other people, and that gets them in the zone where they try hard. So things like that, where there might be something in your routine that's causing you to lose that extra 5% of motivation, and that's maybe why you're not responding that well to the training.
Mm.
'Cause what you're trying to do the most training you can, but you're trying to get the biggest kick from every training session. So you want to be like good sleep, good nutrition, trying really hard on the strength stuff. And endurance is different. Endurance is about volume. And again, that can be similar in that it can be it has to be something that's motivating and enjoyable. Endurance training can be boring, and some people that do well at it, they can zone out and detach and just go through the motions of doing either circuits on a board or running or cycling or whatever, or maybe they listen to something that they can just zone out, music or podcast or whatever. Um, but there has to be something there that allows you to clock up. If you're really having to force out another circuit and you're just like, oh, this is so boring and painful and I just can't be bothered, then you're going to struggle to make real progress. You can do it for 6 weeks, but not for 6 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the kind of basics I'm thinking of.
Do you keep
Yeah.
that kind of do you keep the endurance stuff going all the time, even if you're focused in, like, let's say you're trying to climb a new V14 or something? Um, when you have a rain day and you're on the board, do you keep that endurance stuff going even when you're in more of a bouldering phase?
I try to, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't always manage it if I don't have that if I don't have quite have enough time to train or actually energy to train sometimes. And also sometimes I do get a little bit undisciplined and I get a bit carried away with the bouldering, and I just keep trying the bouldering until I'm actually too tired to do anything else.
Relatable. Yeah.
Yeah, so I do make some mistakes, but I kind of don't I don't mind too much. Like I just enjoy bouldering, so I just do it.
Yeah.
Um, but if I can, yeah, I tend to do circuits most sessions or every session if I can. And the good thing is because it's all on one board, it's easy. It's easy to do, and I do enjoy the circuits. And I do think they
Mm.
are still important for bouldering, and I recognize that myself. Like, um, even if you're training for 6 move boulders, you still have to have that grunt for the last move, and endurance work can really help give you that. Not just the physical endurance, but also the mental capacity to just not let go in the last move and not fade, but
Mm.
like keep up the determination, just not let go.
Hmm. And we will be right back. This episode is brought to you by Madrock. Madrock has a new climbing shoe that I am psyched about, the Drone 2.1. The most versatile performance model of the Drone family, the Drone 2.1 takes elements of the Drone 2 and the Drone CS to offer a hybrid experience. I got really psyched when I heard they were coming out with this shoe because I love the Drone CS. I still wear that shoe a lot. I have a wider foot, so the CS fits me better than the Drone 2.0. But sometimes I want a pointier toe for steep bouldering and for board climbing. The Drone 2.1 is a perfect hybrid. They're a bit softer and more flexible than the Drone 2.0, which means they're super comfortable and fit a wider variety of foot shapes. But they're also super high performance. These are my new favorite board shoe or training shoe for sure. The toe is pointier and less boxy than the other Drone models, which means it's easier to dig into small in-cut footholds when you're climbing at steep angles. And it's honestly made a very noticeable difference for me. I've had some of my best board sessions ever since switching to these shoes. And they're great outside as well, especially for steep bouldering if that's your thing. Like the other drones in the lineup, they're amazing for toe hooking, and they feature the Edge Heel, which is clutch for heel hooking on small crimps and edges. I size them a bit differently than the Drone CS and the 2.0. I wear a US men's size 8 in those two shoes. And in the Drone 2.1, I wear a 7.5. So I size down half a size versus the other drones. And it sounds like that's what most people have found success with as well. Head over to madrock.com and enter code NUGGET10 for 10% off the Drone 2.1. That's madrock.com and code NUGGET10 for 10% off your next order of shoes, crash pads, and more. This episode is brought to you by AG1. Here's the thing, you guys. It's a new year and it's a perfect time to start a new healthy habit. I focus a lot on my nutrition these days, and I don't recommend very many supplements because I think it's best to get all of your needs met by eating nutritious food whenever you can. But I'm still a fan of AG1. It's a small daily habit that delivers huge benefits, and it's a simple way to cover all of your nutritional bases. It can be really hard to eat well all the time. I like AG1 because it fills in any gaps in your nutrition. It's great if you're a vegan or vegetarian because it covers some of the most common nutrient deficiencies on plant-based diets like vitamin B12, or anytime you're traveling or busy and don't have time to cook delicious meals. It's a great backup that can keep you thriving. I like drinking AG1 first thing in the morning. I love starting the day feeling like I'm doing something good for my body. I always feel refreshed and ready to go after drinking my AG1, and I really enjoy it. It also comes with liquid vitamin D with K2, which I find especially helpful this time of year. It's winter here in the Northern Hemisphere, and it's hard to get enough sunlight. And I have many, many friends who swear that taking vitamin D in the winter keeps them from getting sick. I started taking it again recently for immune support and mood, and I really think it helps. AG1 is offering new subscribers a free $76 gift when you sign up. You'll get a welcome kit, a bottle of D3K2, and 5 free travel packs in your first box. So make sure you check out drinkag1.com/nugget to get this offer. That's drinkag1.com/nugget to start your new year on a healthier note. And now back to the show. Yeah. It's yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that about bouldering. I strongly relate to that. Do you intentionally, like, when a bouldering session for you on your board goes really well, are you intentionally forcing yourself to stop before you want to?
No, I mean, usually especially if you train on your own board and you know the problems quite well. So you have them really wired, and so they're very sensitive to your strength. It's really all about strength. So I kind of know that I've got no chance. You know, you try the move so many times, and once your power level starts to drop, like you know, like it's not going to happen.
Mm.
So at that point, I'd just move on to another boulder. But often the sessions will go like do the whole warm up and then try project A, project B, um, until you start to tire, and then you go to the slightly easier projects, but are still quite hard, and you can just keep going with them until until you're getting really quite tired.
Hmm.
So that's tends to be how it works.
Yeah, I think I would love to hear your thoughts about this. I think I tend to do too much of the last thing you said, like kind of chasing it down, like
Hmm. Hmm.
I can tell I'm like dropping in power a little bit, like I can't climb my hardest thing on the board, but I could probably still pull off these other things that are a grade or two easier. Um, I tend to have quite long sessions. I have pretty good like in a session capacity, but I've been thinking lately and reflecting on that and wondering if that actually is one of the things holding me back from reaching my potential top level. Yeah, like I really, if I board climb for an hour, I'm really forcing myself to stop. I want to climb for 2 hours on the board after I've warmed up and like, try
Hmm.
hard for that long. And I feel pretty good that whole time. Like I do leave when I feel like, okay, I'm starting to feel a little bit sloppy here or something. I'll cut the session off, but that's pretty deep
Hmm.
into the session. And then that taxes me enough that I can really only do that like twice a week. Um, which tells me like, oh, I've had this thought experiment several times. Like, what would happen if I really forced myself to stop at an hour? Could I then have 4 sessions a week instead of two? And would that be different? Would I get a different result? I mean, presumably, yes, I'd be a little bit fresher, but how do you think about that stuff? Like, are you, if you are trying your two hardest and then feeling your power drop off a little bit and then, you know, dropping the level slightly to slightly easier things, when do you know when to cut it off?
Well, now we're getting to the territory where I just don't really know the answer to that. I mean,
Mm,
what we've got to go on really is like there are climbers out there who do extremely well with either approach.
mm,
Some do surprisingly little training, and some do absolutely tons. Possibly it depends slightly on the character of the actual projects you're trying. If they're um, quite sort of new school commercial gym style boulder problems, which are quite sort of knacky and technical.
what does
You
knacky
could be,
mean?
um, well, when you're like moving between volumes and it's just like a weird trick of the timing and
Uh,
momentum
yeah,
as much as it is about actually like pure power.
yeah, okay.
Maybe you can get away with a lot more volume on that sort of terrain. You just keep trying and trying and trying, and it just doesn't really matter. Especially some of some of the problems these days on commercial gyms, there, especially on the slabby walls. Like you could just there's not really much limit. Once you reach a certain level of fitness, like you can just keep going and going. Yeah.
Hmm.
But on like pure board climbs, then you're just not going to be able to do the moves. I think maybe the decider is when you're just not doing the moves.
Mm,
you know, it's just going to vary depending on the difficulty of the project. Like I've got projects on my board where um, if I'm like in good shape, I can do them first try. But if I'm like not quite recovered from the previous session, then I might have to project them for um, half an hour or an hour. And then I've got some where they're like long-term things, and if I feel good, I might try like to do that one move that I can't do, or to link two moves together. So if I'm trying to link two moves together, and that's the limit project, and then I get to the stage after half an hour or an hour where I can't do either move at all,
mm,
then yeah, okay, I'll move on to something else.
hmm.
But if I'm like climbing 8 moves to the last move and falling off there, then I would just keep, as long as I could do that, I would keep going.
Okay.
Even sometimes, even if I feel like my power level's going down, I would still persist for a bit at least. Um, yeah, so I'm not sure I have a solid answer for that.
Hmm. That's
Um,
fair.
I
Yeah.
I always think though about motivation is important. Is like if you've got if you've got motivation to train and it's not hurting you, then it's probably fine to keep doing it.
Mm,
Um, But honestly, I don't really know. I guess there's only one way to find out with a lot of training questions, and that's just to try it, try both approaches and see how it goes.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. Yeah, something I'm learning and getting hopefully a little better at is really rolling with the punches, so to speak. Like, I had a day at the day after Thanksgiving, I randomly had like my best board session ever. I don't know if it was the pie or the turkey or I don't know what it was, but I just felt unstoppable. And I
Yeah.
kept going and going and going. And I had like a 2.5 hour board session where I just kept sending things. It was crazy. And I was just like, oh my God, like I've kind of leveled up. This is amazing. And then the next two sessions after that didn't go nearly as well, unsurprisingly. The first step off a peak is down, right?
Hmm.
Um, but what I'm still learning, and I think I have a lot of room for maturity and like growth here, is the next two sessions I kind of knew early in the session, like I'm not feeling great today,
Yeah.
but I still have this really strong tendency to try to power through. Like, no, I'm going to make it a good day instead of like, oh, I'm not feeling great today. What else can I do? That's not a limit bouldering session. There's plenty of options. There's tons of things I could do that are not that, and then I could come back probably 2 days later and have a really strong session. But I tend to, if it's on the schedule, or if I even just had it in my head that, oh, I want to boulder really hard again on Monday,
Hmm.
whenever. Um, yeah, I'll start to warm up. I'll start to climb. I'm not feeling great. And I'm just like, well, I'm here. This is supposed to be a hard bouldering day. So I'm going to rally and try hard.
Mm.
I'm trying to learn how to really just go with the flow and
Yeah.
honor whatever, message I'm getting from my body and roll with it instead of kind of powering through.
Yeah. It's tricky. It's tricky that because
Yeah.
you said sometimes you'll turn up and have sessions that you just are amazing and they kind of come out of the blue and you don't really know why they were so good, but they just were. But you'll also occasionally have sessions where you warm up and don't feel good, but then
And then
after
you,
your warm up, all of a sudden
yeah,
you do
I
feel
know.
amazing. But and
It's,
also the reverse. And
yeah.
that this is where you're getting into the complexity of like how your body's responding and like there's all these things. It's like your strength, like your state of recovery, fueling, conditions on the board, how your training's been the last few weeks. All these things are all integrating together to your performance on any given session. And there's probably no right or wrong answer a lot of the time. You could warm up and think, I don't feel. I sometimes do this. Like I warm up and think, I don't feel good, but I really want to try that hard project. So I'm just going to stop and just continue the rest. Just have another rest day, and I'll come back tomorrow.
Mm.
And so I'll have had 2 rest days or 3 rest days, and then I'll definitely have the good session because I'll be very well rested.
So
Or sometimes I'll think,
you might have done your whole warm up and then make that decision.
yeah, yeah, or hope ideally you would kind of know that quite early on. Like the earlier
Mm.
the better. Like if you really weren't rested, the earlier you decide to just can it, the better. But
Hmm.
I mean that's easy when your board's like 2 meters from your back door.
Yeah.
But if you've like driven across town to go to the climbing center, then maybe it's actually a better decision just to continue and adjust your session and do something else. So
Mm.
that's probably one of those like it depends on the individual and it depends on the environment and other parameters that are at play. But it's one of those things that I wouldn't worry about too much. Like if you if you change the session and do something that's similar, um, or if you just do the same session but less of it, like you do 3 good tries and then stop on the hard project, or you just rest and then come back tomorrow. I think they're all fine, and it's like almost getting to the splitting hairs stage where it's not really that important. I don't think it'll. I don't think those decisions are going to dictate whether you get to the next grade in 1 or 2 years' time.
Mm.
It is going to be
Yeah.
more basic stuff like the more the habits that are playing out over time,
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
and that's usually where, to me, that's the value of a coach, or a mentor or a friend that you climb with. Um, a lot of people get training programs, and they the training programs that you follow remotely are a sort of double-edged sword because they often people feel an obligation to stick to the program because that's what they've been given, and that's a good thing. That's one of the best things about training programs is it introduces some external influence to give you consistency. But sometimes too much consistency can be a thing where if you've just not had a good sleep, if the coach was standing in front of you, they'd say, just rest, come back tomorrow. And you'd be like, oh, right, okay, that's fine. But in the absence of the coach standing to have that discussion, um, you might think, oh, it's on the sheet. I better do it. And then you have a poor quality session and it's not really that helping you that much.
Mm.
So that's where training programs are a bit tricky. But to me, like, um, if I was going to get a coach to help me with climbing, I'd always want it to be an in-person coach or someone that I can just talk to a lot to bounce these ideas off, and then they can help you adjust those things but spots the deeper problems. Like like for the past 3 months, you've had quite a lot of these sessions where you're turning up saying you're a bit tired. What's the reason for that? Let's get to the bottom of that. And then you're like, well, yeah, I've had this other work project on, and so I've not been getting to bed. And you're like, yeah, that's the real problem.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's usually something more fundamental.
Yeah.
Or you're like, well, I come to this bouldering wall and I used to train with that guy that I got on really well with, and we bounced off each other, but then he moved house or he got injured and my training partner's gone. And all of a sudden, that's the real reason for the problem. Or it's like, well, yeah, this pulley injury is not quite healed, and so I'm just a little bit cautious. And yes, you're not pulling hard on the hold, so you're not getting strong. So it's like
Hmm.
fix that, and then so again, it's usually the basic stuff that's more important.
I want to ask you about consistency when it comes to hangboarding specifically. I know we've talked about hangboarding a lot, you and I. Uh, but I always have more questions, Dave.
Cool.
But the thing that I have personally struggled with, and I've talked to quite a few listeners who've struggled with this sort of thing as well. Like you are a champion of just effort, trying really hard,
Yeah.
really like coaxing your fingers to adapt. And it makes a lot of sense. I personally, and I know many folks out there have struggled with doing that and having that be sustainable so that they can be consistent long enough for that to make, the desired adaptation. Like what I found personally is that I can be really consistent with finger training in addition to my climbing, like just a little bit of hangboarding. I usually do it like after a warm up, then I'll do it and then I'll climb. Um, I can be really consistent with that if I'm pretty far from maximal effort. Like if I'm kind of punching the clock in like the 70, 75, maybe 80% range, I can really
Hmm.
sustain that. And it just feels like it kind of warms me up to try my hardest on the board or out on the rock or whatever. I've tried your approach. I've tried, just a very simple hangboard routine of standing with my feet on the ground and just pulling down really hard on an edge or, using like another finger in a mono or something like that. And progressing that way, more maximal effort, low volume. And what
Hmm.
I personally find is that it just kind of always leads to getting tweaked. Like I can never sustain it very long. And so I never get that like compounding, growth from 6 or 9 or 12 or 18 months of doing that. Um, have you had a lot of people that you've worked with be able to sustain your style of finger training? And if so, what are they doing that I might be missing? Or is it just the individual, or is it maybe that I'm climbing too much in addition to the finger training, and so just the total training load is too much? Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the short answer, unfortunately, is I don't really know.
I knew you
It
were going
might
to
be
say
that if I spent time with you, um, I might start to have some ideas. It could well be that it's a total volume, either a total volume of training or total volume of recovery, some imbalance in those things.
that.
That's the problem, or something to do with form or something like that. But I mean, I see fingerboarding as an extremely safe training tool. Um, it shouldn't really cause finger tweaks. if if you stick to some basic things, such as um, if you stand under the board and actually pull your weight off the ground, like the people I watch on the fingerboard who I think they're going to get injured, it's when people like try to jump off the ground on a hang that's too hard for them, or they do it with like sweaty fingers and like their fingers are moving on the edge while they're maximally loaded. These are sort of basic errors that people make all the time, but I think that's the things that cause people tweaks. Um, I would tend to think that if you're getting problems with tweaky fingers, that's the problem is elsewhere. It could be to do with volume, um, could be to do with something to do with recovery. It's going to be like sleep, diet, total training volume. I don't. I still see like max hangs as being a very safe thing. They are what build resilience in fingers.
Yeah.
So I don't think they would necessarily cause the problem.
Well, and to
Except with
clarify,
poor form.
sorry, what was the last thing you said? I didn't mean to cut
Except
you off.
except with poor form.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, to clarify, I don't think I've ever gotten tweaked while hangboarding. It's
Yeah.
usually like, oh, I'll do this routine that's really consistent for 4 or 5 or 6 weeks or something.
Hmm.
And then just, I'm also like climbing hard on the board or outside and, suddenly, oh, I've got a sore finger and I've got to pull back a bit. And it
Hmm.
just seems
Yeah.
like every time I try to stick with like a more maximal loading protocol for, a month or longer,
Hmm.
yeah, oh, a finger's sore all of a sudden, or like, oh, my wrist feels a little tweaky, I've got to back off a bit, or like, oh, my elbow, or just something
Yeah.
always just kind of gets a little angry, and it's like a
Yeah.
slow, it's not like an acute thing. It's usually just like, oh, I'm getting that sign of overdoing it, need to back
Yeah.
off,
I
and then
mean,
I
top
get in my head
top of the
about the
list.
what was that? So,
Top of the list, I think, for the suspects or for the cause of that would be too much total volume of hard climbing
okay.
and not enough rest. Like if you're trying to if you're warming up and trying to do a session when your fingers are already kind of like not quite recovered. Um, yeah, that would be like what I would suspect. Um, and then you'd mentioned um yeah, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure what would be the problem there. But that would be the prime suspect. I think is just too much total volume of climbing.
Hmm.
Um, so there's consistency, but the consistency applies to both rest and recovery as much as it
Mm,
does to training.
yeah, that's a good
Um,
nugget. Yeah.
and I don't have any idea of what the content of your climbing and training looks like, or your recovery. Um, I mean, one. So I think about this for myself in a very different way, whether I'm at home or whether I'm on a climbing trip. When I'm at home, and I'm mixing up work and training, and I have a really flexible schedule. So if I feel good, I train, and if I don't feel good, I work. So I never feel like I'm not doing anything,
Hmm.
and that works really well. On climbing trips, I have to be super careful not to overdo it because I just
Hmm.
want to climb everything,
Uh-huh.
and I know that's not gonna work. And I've been on countless climbing trips with friends who I usually climb day on, day off, on climbing trips, and so many friends try to climb every day and end up either just exhausted or exhausted and injured.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what if you're away from home and work and you have access to uh, climbing and you're wanting to get out every day and do it, then that can be a source of overdoing it.
Hmm.
Yeah, but does that apply to you?
No, well,
No.
yes and no. I don't climb every day. At the most, I'll climb day on, day off usually.
Mhm.
It really depends on the area though. Like I can climb a lot more back home in Leavenworth on the granite than I
Mhm.
can here.
Mhm.
I'm on a quick trip to Waco Tanks right now. I'm actually in the
Mm.
exact spot that we recorded our first episode, I think.
Ah.
Same campsite even. Um, but yeah, here, I mean, I can climb 3 days a week, and only two of those can be try hard days. I've learned
Yeah.
that over my years in Waco. Like it's
Yeah.
just so physical, and the days tend to be so long. That's the other side of
Hmm.
it. Like you get in the park
Mm.
and you go through all the hoops, and you're out on a tour, and you just climb for like 6 hours, or 8 hours or
Mm.
something with little breaks and lunch and stuff in there. But um, yeah, I've experienced the Waco downward spiral several times where you show up and you're fit, and the first session on your project goes really well, and then every session after that just gets like worse and worse, and eventually you can't do the moves. I've definitely experienced that. So it depends on the area, but I think I don't climb too often, I think, but I think I tend to go maybe too deep into like a recovery hole when I do climb. I really like to
Hmm.
have long sessions. I get psyched, and it takes me a while to warm up. So once I do get warmed up and I'm like firing, I can kind of hum and like stay there for many hours. And I like that.
Yeah.
But maybe it's worth trying for me, just like almost artificially cutting my sessions shorter and just
Yeah.
seeing how that feels.
That makes sense to me. You said that a few times now that you tend to
Right.
like
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
go along. So yeah, that gives me an impression that that's a possibility to explore. You could that
Hmm.
would be a great experiment to do. It's just for, a trip or a season or something like that. Let's try the opposite strategy of I'm going to I'm going to leave 20% in the tank at the end of the session, and then see how that goes with your fingers. And when you say you got tweaky fingers, is it pulleys that hurt or finger joints?
Yeah, the last like I haven't had a bad injury in a couple years or several years, thankfully. But what's happened a few times in the last couple years is I'll just get a sore pulley.
Hmm.
It won't be like a pop, it won't be a real injury, but it's enough where I'm like, ooh, it's kind of trending in the wrong direction. I've got to pull back and
Mm.
adjust my climbing and stop hangboarding, or only hangboard and drag, or whatever,
Yeah.
for sometimes a few weeks, sometimes a couple months.
Mm.
But that's happened enough times that it's really gotten in the way of what I want to do, which is punch the clock and be really consistent and see those
Hmm.
compounding gains. So,
Hmm. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean the another core of consistency is actually being in the game, like not not being injured. Uh,
Yeah,
so
right.
um so it is like a kind of marathon in a way, and that um in the short term it might feel like you're going backwards to back off slightly and take an extra rest day or three rest days. But actually over the course of a year that results in more total training overall. So if you look at it on the 2 week um like schedule, you might think, oh, I've lost like all these days, so I've done less training. But if you take it out to a year, it ends up being more because you've not felt tweaky at all. And you've had more good, not only more sessions, but more good quality sessions.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Have you, going back to an earlier question, have you seen clients or people who follow you try your style of finger training and had great success? Like, do you get a lot of feedback on that? Because there's so many ways to train fingers, so many opinions out there, so many protocols to try. I really like about your approach just the simplicity of it. It's just dead simple to do. Um, yeah, are you hearing from people that have seen similar kind of jumps as you've experienced with that approach?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've I've seen people use fingerboards in many different ways, and all have quite good results. Um, and I used to write training programs for years for climbers, and some had really dramatic improvements. It's quite amazing, but you have to be so cautious about those because, like, I can think of one guy I wrote a training program for, and when I wrote the program, he was climbing 512B, and then he got in touch with me about 2 or 3 years later, and he was climbing 14A.
Wow.
um, but possibly he was on that path anyway,
Right.
and whether he'd you know followed what I'd suggested or not, he still would have got very similar results. So I would take that with a pinch of salt. That's the difficulty with looking at individual anecdotes is you really don't know. So that's why I always um, base how I think about training on more fundamental principles. The anecdotes are good, but there you have to be careful with them. Um, so the more basic principles are like in order to get all your muscle fibers to fire, and especially the fast twitch fibers, it does need a high force, or it needs the other fibers to fatigue out. So you can use lower force if you hang on to failure, and then as the other fibers fatigue out, it recruits, the ones that are left over, if you like, and then you will achieve actually firing all of those fibers, and then they hopefully respond and grow stronger. But strength, although strength is dependent on muscle mass, it's also very dependent on it's a central nervous component of the size of the neural drive from the brain and the coordination of it. So strength is in part a skill.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of why the basic research on strength and muscle gain shows that people can gain muscle mass, but not necessarily gain strength at a corresponding rate, and vice versa. People can gain strength without, even as they lose muscle, they can gain strength
Mm.
within limits. So they overlap, strength and muscle mass, but not completely.
Right.
So that's why I do think like trying really hard it's actually a skill that you're learning that you need in your performance to really grab a hold and not let go of it.
Hmm.
Um, so I do think that's why the high forces are important, at least some of the time. Yeah, and
Yeah.
with the low intensity work, like some people do like very low intensity hangboarding. Um, I don't tend to choose that. There's nothing wrong with it. But I tend to prefer just doing fingery climbing instead, because it pretty much does the same job. It's just loading your fingers at this roughly the same intensity, but you're doing it in a real climbing situation, which helps you to keep sharp on the climbing skill.
Mm.
However, if I was like, if I were like worked on an oil rig or something, and for a 3 week stint, then I would do it on the hangboard,
Yeah.
just to keep the volume up. Yeah,
Gotcha. So yeah, repeaters or like no hangs or some of these lower intensity
exactly.
things.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, they're for in your mind they're like a replacement for climbing when you don't have the option of climbing.
Primarily, yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
that makes
I
sense.
mean, for some people, it's like just getting used to actually hanging on small holds is a good thing. The fingerboard's good for that. It's like just being used to hanging on a fingery edge. Like it's such a core thing, holding on to small holds if you want to be good at rock climbing. So that's where it really comes into its own, almost in an almost separate way from the actual strength gains. You just get used to taking something that's small and just feeling like, yes, I can really pull up on that. That is a good hold. Yeah. So yeah, a constant reminder that that's okay. That your body's geared up to do that is a
Mm,
good thing.
yeah.
So sometimes I think the fingerboard can be useful for people to just get used to small holds.
Hmm. Totally. That makes sense. Are you seeing changes in your own finger strength still? I mean, last time we talked, this is a year and a half ago. You did that McDonald's experiment and just had like a mind-blowing PR
Mm.
on the hangboard after 2 months
Yeah,
of eating McDonald's patties, which is fucking fascinating. Still so
yeah.
interesting. We talked about that in length. So that was a year and a half ago. Are you still seeing occasional PRs, or are you working harder to just maintain your level of finger strength? Like, how has that changed over time?
Yeah. I mean, I've been trying to, obviously, still trying to improve as much as possible. And in the spring, in March, I felt really good, felt really strong. I'd been trying a boulder project for 3 winters, and I managed to complete it. And it definitely felt really good after that. And that was
What was
interesting.
that one?
Like, it was a problem called Bultitude. There's a video of it on my YouTube channel, and I sort of showed some footage of like trying it over a few seasons. But it was so cool. I was, you know, like a lot of short boulders, like it's not the boulder itself is not much to look at, and it's just like these sequence of four moves. So it's like it's only really me that can appreciate like uh how important it was to me personally to do it because I just had so many sessions where I was like, this is not happening. Like, I have no chance of doing this. I could see it's possible. The holds are all there, but they're all just these awkward undercuts. And I just felt like I just did not have the raw power. Um, so many interesting things about that process. One of them being the actual technical knack for the crux move I discovered on the session before I actually did the problem. I mean, I must have had, goodness knows how many tens of sessions I had on that climb, but you would think I'd have figured out every solution. But I was changing the foot sequence still like right through the process. And I'd also find that as time went by, there'd be subtle changes in my own strengths. Like sometimes I would have slightly stronger fingers, but a weaker body. And
Mm.
sometimes I'd have a stronger body, but weaker fingers. And how the moves felt, like, I actually had to change the foot sequence based on that. It was
Yeah.
bizarre. And then there was like some methods for the crux that I could do initially. And then like the following season, I just couldn't touch it that way.
Mm.
But there'd be some other method that I'd tried before and couldn't do, and then all of a sudden I could do it. And it's really, really weird.
Yeah.
Um, but what led up to actually completing it um, was just a whole season of bouldering on my board that was quite steady. I didn't do much winter climbing, so it was quite consistent, just bouldering and fingerboard, nothing special, just clocking in the training sessions. But then, about 3 weeks before I did the climb, I had a 2 week period of incredibly intense training where I was really worried that I'd totally overcooked it and I was going to get injured. And it started off with every year I run coaching sessions in my wall for 4 or 5 days. Um, but there's usually I do like 3 days. I do a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, just one weekend a year over the local mountain festival. But they're so popular and they always sell out. So I did 2 weekends. I did like, yeah, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 2 weekends in a row. And they're always very intense. There's a lot of good climbers come to them. And so, you're climbing all day, hard bouldering. And I always feel quite tired after those sessions. But then after the second weekend, I was straight into filming my technique course that's on the altitude platform. And that was really intense. That was like I did a load of setting for a week in my board. So I was like setting all these problems to demonstrate different techniques and testing them all. Because the filming we were going to do was all squeezed into a few days. And then I had like 8 days in a row on the board climbing pretty much all day.
Wow.
And I was doing a lot of mid-grade boulder problems, but also a lot of the harder stuff on my board. And I was absolutely cooked after it. And then I had 4 days off, and I was like this with my fingers, like, oh no, what have I done? Like I felt really tweaky. Then I had 4 days off. I had one day on the project, and I was like, oh yeah, I've got a wee bump in strength. And then I had one more day's rest, and then I did it.
Wow.
Yeah, it was great. So it was a lesson to me. It's like um, it's a little bit high risk, but sometimes if you've got a consistent base to go from, just pushing the training a bit. Maybe if I did that for one more week, I would have ended up with an injury.
Mm.
I don't know. Who knows? But it was just enough that it worked out well to give me a little peak, and
Mm.
that got my project finished. It was great.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. Voltage. Is that what you said? Voltage is the name?
So it's called Bultitude. Yeah, the problem here,
Okay.
which is it's the name of a a bear in this like novel, but it's just because the boulder's called the animal boulder because it just looks like the head of a bear. And so the project, my friend Rob showed me it, and it was just always known as the Animal Project. Yeah, so and it's just like when you walk away from the boulder, I'd always be walking away from the boulder in the dusk, and when you look back at it, it really does look like a bear. So yeah, that's where the name came from.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
What did you grade it?
V14.
Okay. That's
Yeah,
amazing, man. So one of your hardest, what, top two, top three, top five, something like that?
yeah, I would say so. Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, yeah, without going back to other things I've done in the past, it's really tough to know. Like, am I as strong or weaker or stronger than I was when I was on that 80 plus years ago, you know? Yeah, but yeah, I first tried it in 2019, um, when I was going really well. I'd just done um, a 9A sport route that I'd been trying for years and years. Um, and then I went immediately and tried that, and I couldn't touch it. But I
Wow.
hadn't worked out all the beta, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, hard to know.
That's awesome though. V14, just four moves. I
Yeah.
mean, that's awesome.
So your question originally was about um, hangboarding and strength, and am I still improving and things? So one other thing that happened this year was in the summer, I was down in Sheffield in England, and I went to the like La Sportiva athlete meet, and we were just having fun at the climbing wall. And I don't know if you'll have come across Louis Parkinson. He's a great YouTube channel,
Yeah,
and
he's been on the
um,
podcast.
yeah, well, he was for this. He was making a video in the climbing wall, and he was wanting to do a little competition with all the La Sportiva athletes. So he invited us all to think about something that we were good at, that we could compete with him on. So I said, "Oh, well, three finger drag, dead hang." Um, so on on the Beastmaker Edge. I can't remember, that's 21 or 22 mil or something like that.
Yeah, yeah,
But on the
22, 23.
Beastmaker Edge, I did hang with 18 and a half kilos. So
Whoa.
um, that beats my record on my own hangboard, which is like a 21 mil edge. I After that McDonald's experiment in that video, I broke my PB for that, and it was 16 and a half kilos. But it felt so. I only did it the once. I didn't even try it again because it just felt dangerous to hang on with that much weight. So I didn't really try it again. But yeah, so I sort of, if you, it's slightly different, and it also fingerboards in commercial climbing gyms are always easier than my own, because my own one is clean.
Hmm.
But if I go to a Beastmaker in a commercial gym, they're always caked in chalk, and
Hmm.
there's much better friction, and I
Oh.
can always do so much better. I always remember that once, like I remember having an ankle surgery, uh, and about two days after I came out of my surgery, I went to the climbing wall in Glasgow, like because I had surgery in Glasgow, and then I stayed at my parents' house for a day, and then I went to the climbing wall and just for a fingerboard session. And I felt like you do after you've just come out of surgery. I felt rotten, and I was like really sore and groggy and not good. And then I went on this Beastmaker. I remembered like doing a hang on the two finger pocket, a one handed hang on the two finger pocket in the Beastmaker, and I was like, wow, like I've never been able to do that before. How come I'm so strong? But and then I tried it on my own one and I couldn't touch it. Yeah, but it's just because like the cake chalk makes a big difference.
Mm.
So I guess that PB doesn't really count.
I mean, it's same size edge. I think that's pretty impressive.
Yeah,
Yeah, 18 and a half. I mean, that's more than 40 pounds. It's got to be. Yeah, in
yeah,
addition to your body weight. That's amazing. That is very
yeah. So I
cool.
don't feel like I'm getting weaker, although I haven't done much training in the last couple of months. Um, so I'm sort of at a low point right now. It's funny, like to have a year where I felt amazing in the spring, and then I actually had quite a good summer of sport climbing, and then in the autumn I've not been doing much. So yeah, pretty weak at the moment. One way to turn that around.
Yeah, yeah, it happens. We all go through seasons. So it's interesting. Your last couple PRs have been three finger drag. Is there a difference in which grips have continued to improve over time? Like, and is it changing your climbing style? Like, are you gravitating more towards the drag position and seeing more benefit or more gains there than full crimps or half crimps?
I think there's not much difference. I do, if I feel strong on one grip, I feel strong on all of them
Okay.
because I do train all of them. But possibly the three finger drag, um, either either because of the nature of the drag or because I feel quite strong on it. Um, the differences are more noticeable. So, like with a crimp grip, um, like my PB might be like, oh, it was plus 4 kilos on the other hand, and now it's plus five. With the drag, it'll be like, well, it was plus eight, and then it's plus 16. There's
Mm,
just proportionally a bigger difference without that much difference in strength. I mean, that's one of the things I was pointing out in that video after my McDonald's experiment was like this might reflect in reality quite a small increase in strength. It just seems big because of the testing method. Um,
what do you mean by that? Like it's getting conflated because of friction and other factors?
yeah,
I see.
there's like friction, and I definitely think that uh, I noticed that if I lose a small amount of weight, compared like my weight fluctuates like anyone. So if I like test when I'm 3 kilos heavier and have a number for how much weight I can hang from the fingerboard, and then I lose 3 kilos, weirdly I can add more weight in my other hand, which might
Mm,
seem like weird. I don't really have an explanation for it other than it might be something to do with friction on the board, but it doesn't like tie up neatly,
right.
which is always
Yeah.
why I'm slightly cautious about measuring things in training because sometimes like you're not always measuring exactly what you think you're measuring.
Yeah.
You know?
That's so fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is that? Like you lose 3 kilos of body weight, but suddenly you can hang body weight plus an extra 8 kilos
Yeah.
or 10 or
Yeah.
something. What is that? That's so bizarre. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's like maybe that weight loss, maybe, or rather, maybe the weight gain, maybe there's like inflammation going on or other factors at play that compromise your
Yeah.
tendon integrity, or that's so interesting.
I, I honestly don't know. I mean, I would speculate it might be something else to do with like stabilizing the weight as you're hanging on it. Um, but I honestly don't really know.
Huh. Okay.
Be a good piece of research to try and figure
Yeah.
out why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. Okay. I'm going to ask this question, bouncing around out of order. I know I haven't forgotten about LDL or fruit or any of those other topics, but
Yeah.
since we're kind of on this theme, um, I wanted to ask you, and this is very self-serving, but I'm using myself as an example. Hopefully, it's helpful for everybody listening. Um, what advice do you have for people that want to still be climbing near their best in their mid 40s? I'll use myself as an example because I'm in that stage of life where I see a lot of people. There seems to be a big fork in the road, right? Like I know a lot of people who get into climbing as kids or as teenagers or in their early 20s or sometimes even early 30s. Um, but what often tends to happen is people progress and progress and progress, and then they get into their mid 30s or early 40s. They, their career changes. Maybe they start a family. Maybe they move, whatever. And a lot of people, that's the end of their progress in climbing, and they
Hmm.
fall off, or they kind of maintain, or climbing just becomes less of a priority. And maybe that's the answer. Maybe it just comes down to priorities. But um, on the flip side, you have some folks who just keep on going. You are a great example. Martin Keller is like one of my
Hmm.
favorite examples as well, climbing his hardest boulders ever. And he just boulders, which is so impressive that he's staying healthy. Well, he's had some injuries, but he's continuing to push his max bouldering grade well into his 40s. Um, what separates those people? Like, what do people often miss that might make the difference between plateauing or peaking kind of early, let's say in their 30s, versus people who are thriving and climbing their hardest well into their 40s?
Lots to unpack in that question, but I start with number one, um, the people who keep going and keep progressing, I think they have the fire. So in order to uh, do what they do, the challenge for any climber is to find what they're really passionate about in climbing, and they really not just enjoy, but I would even go beyond enjoyment. I describe it as fire, like what gets you to need to do it, not just want to do it. Um, for me, that is the combination of I still enjoy working out moves. So I enjoy working out moves whether I'm fit or whether I'm unfit, whether I'm climbing well or not, whatever rock type I'm climbing on, whoever I'm climbing with. Um, so that allows me to take great enjoyment from climbing, no matter the circumstances. Um, so that I think that's the core thing. Um, and then there's aspects of climbing that are maybe not, I mean, not that exciting, but you have to try and find a way to make them enjoyable. So some people, if they have a great partnership in climbing, a good training partner or set of training partners who they just enjoy hanging out with, uh, that can be the thing. I think a lot of people drift out of their sport, not just climbing, because the person they used to do it with drifts away from it, and
Mm.
that they were actually core, and they possibly need to do some work to actively find someone else to do it with. I've never been like that. I enjoy climbing just on my own, but again, it's like that's because working out moves is the core thing I enjoy. It never gets old. And so I don't really have to force myself to be motivated. If you're having to actively do work to motivate yourself, it will get tiring, and eventually it won't be that important. Other things in life will be important. So there has to be something in your motivation that's insatiable, that you will always want to keep doing it. So the combination of, for me personally, it's working out moves and just being outside on the crags. I've actually been injured the last month or two myself, and I've not been able to rock climb. Yesterday, that's with a foot injury, so I can't wear my rock shoe. But I've been able to mix climb. So we've had some snow. So yesterday I went out mix climbing, and as we were walking back down from our climb last night in the dark, I was walking past some overhanging rock, and just took my gloves off, and I was just touching it with my hands and just hanging on these holds, and it just made me realize, like, just see the feeling of rough rock in my hands. It just is amazing to me. It's like
Mm.
almost like an addiction. I just love it. The texture and character of rock and the complexity of it, and then that leads immediately back into movement on it. I just
Mm.
get so much enjoyment from that, and that's never got old. So I think that's the core that sustains you with motivation. It forces you, when life leads you in some other direction, it brings me back onto a path of climbing. That's absolutely key. Um, then sometimes it can be about, like, having a bit of courage to make some decisions that change the direction of your life. Whether that's like um, moving to a different city, or close to a climb, um, or not choosing to live in a house at all, like a van, or whatever, or just changing job, changing career, or keeping the same career but not allowing it to just swallow up your entire life, and
Mm.
just having a hard boundary to say, no, I'm not doing that. I need that time to climb. Um, yeah, I think modern society is geared up to take more and more from us, especially work and careers, and there has to be a hard boundary. I mean, one of the things I do is I, I look at my email and answer my email when I'm ready.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, there's like, I could be solving a million problems, other people's problems all the time,
Yeah.
and never go climbing, but that's not the way to do it. If sun's shining, I'm going climbing, and that's a sort of hard rule. And so I did sort of at some point need to decide, like, that's my approach to life, and I'm gonna hold on to it.
Yeah.
Um, and then there's the practical things, like, you know, some people's climbing standard completely changes when the climbing wall that was next to them shuts down, or when a new climbing wall opens up, or they move house near to some good climbing, or they move house near to a good climbing area. Um, So arranging your circumstances to lower the hurdles and just make things easier. So I mean, in my book, um, I was talking about a stage in my life where I lived a completely different lifestyle to the one I do now. So now my life is super busy and complex. I have a million things to do all the time. But I offset that by having a brilliant board 2 meters from my back door, and I live with endless climbing all around me. So I can have a very busy work schedule and still train, and that's fine. When in the period in that my book describes, uh, I did like a few days work a month, and I was scrabbling around, literally counting coins to buy food. Um, but I had lots of time. But I didn't drive a car. I had very low outgoings. My climbing wall, which was Dumbarton Rock, was free and it was 10 minutes walk away. And that was like my daily office. So
Mm.
I lowered the hurdles to access my training. I lived a very frugal lifestyle and a very simple lifestyle without much work, without much earning, but without much need to earn. So there's no right or wrong way to do it, but you maybe do have to think like how do I want to do this? Do I if I'm going to have like a 40, 50 hour work week, how am I going to fit climbing in? There's some simple practical decisions to be made. Right, I'm going to have the career and I'm going to earn a good amount of money, but I'm going to make sure that amount of money allows me to live in that place right next to that good climbing wall, and I'm going to have a gym in my house, and then it'll work. Or you could decide, no, stuff that. I'm not going to earn a lot of money. I'm going to work 6 months of the year or 3 days a week, and I'm going to have less, but I'm going to live next to Waco tanks and be a boulderer. Either way is fine, whatever suits you, but just
Hmm.
make the decision to do it. So
Yeah.
it's like these things I think are always the combination of like the underlying fire and then the practicalities and just constant. It's a constant work. I mean, I have to do it all the time, like trying to decide like how do I want to do this. I've also had some more subtle things where about up to about 10 years ago, I really liked training late at night and it worked really well for me. So I could work 12 to 16 hours in the day. And then I used to train from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m.
Wow.
And it was just great. It just fitted in so well. But now, for some reason, which I don't know, I can't seem to do that anymore. Now, when it gets to 11 p.m., I feel knackered and I know I can't train. But I'm finding it harder to know when the best time of day to train is. And that might seem like a small deal, but it's actually quite a challenge and it's really getting in the way of my training routine. So I haven't quite decided if I'm a morning training person or if do a few hours work and then train in the middle of the day and then do a few hours work. I don't seem
Mm.
to get on very well with that. So I'm actually trying to force myself right now to reestablish my routine and set like a new sort of way of working to keep me going in the future.
Mm.
But it would be very easy not to do that and just let life start to dictate it. And then gradually the training gets a bit lost and then you lose some fitness and then you feel like, oh, well, maybe I'm coming towards 50, maybe I can't do this anymore. And then 5 years passes and then, yeah, well, then you've got a long way to come back. So I'm going to try and not let that happen and be just a bit proactive. And it might just be like one or two little decisions where I say, right, okay, I've decided that my training time is 12 noon till 4 p.m. and I'm going to do that every day. And that's how I'm going to work it. I work in the mornings and the evenings and I train during the day. And then if that works and I stick to it, then bingo. And that's all it really needs.
Mm.
And then the third thing is not getting injured. Injuries are often what derails climbers' careers. And I know this from bitter experience. I've had some significant injuries and I'm dealing with some now, and it's not it's not easy, and especially as you age, um, you sometimes have injuries where you feel like I really don't know if I can keep doing this at this standard. It's like going to be really difficult. How am I going to do it? And you have to not only work very hard to claw back your just ability to climb, um, but you also need to suspend disbelief a little bit and think, yeah, even though things can get harder as you age, like you still can heal and you still can recover and you still can have good form again. And I've done that many times in the past, like going through phases where for 6 months, um, you've got some really bad injury and you're just like, oh, how am I going to come back from this? And then in a year's time, it's long forgotten and you're back to doing something really good and you're climbing again.
Mm,
And it'd be kind of easy just to think, oh, I can't do it anymore. But what
yeah.
always draws me back is just the fire. Like if I try a project, all I really need is to just go out and find new projects, and then they do their work for me. I like I'll go try the project, I try the moves, and I just think I need to find a way to get good enough,
That's
and then
cool.
it unravels after that.
And we will be right back. This episode is brought to you by Arc'teryx. For over 35 years, Arc'teryx has been providing climbers with technical high-performance apparel, outerwear, and equipment inspired by climbers who are pushing the limits of possibility in alpine environments. And now, Arc'teryx is excited to announce their new Alpine Climb soft shell kits. The Psiphon and Serratus are engineered for multi-pitch days when unrestricted movement and thermal comfort are critical. Inspired by one of North America's beloved alpine playgrounds, the Bugaboos, the Psiphon and Serratus enable more freedom to move across the wall with the same reliable weather protection, durability, and breathability that Arc'teryx soft shells are known for. I love this company. They make really high quality gear. It's tested and vetted by cutting edge athletes, and it's the real deal. These new kits are amazing for alpine climbing, obviously, but they're also great for winter sport climbing or trad climbing or even bouldering. The Psiphon hoodie and pants are specifically designed for women with articulating patterning for mobility and comfort while climbing. And the Serratus hoodie and pants are designed for men, and they are both awesome. Head to arcteryx.com or a store near you to check out Arc'teryx's new Psiphon and Serratus kits launching January 15th. That's arcteryx.com or visit an outdoor store near you to check out Arc'teryx's new Psiphon and Serratus kits launching January 15th. This episode is brought to you by Fizzy Vantage, the official climbing nutrition sponsor of the Nugget Climbing Podcast. Fizzy Vantage is the leading brand in climbing nutrition with more than 40 professional climbers now using Fizzy Vantage products daily to serve their training and climbing performance. Many of those names have been on the show: Alex Magos, Natalia Grossman, Matt Foltz, Jonathan Segrist, Paige Klassen, Drew Ruwana, and many others. These folks take Fizzy Vantage for a reason. Visit fizzyvantage.com to learn more about their many innovative research-based nutrition products and supplements, including their revolutionary supercharged collagen. That's my personal favorite. I take it before my training sessions to support my fingers and tendons and hopefully gain more finger strength. The pre-workout and performance-boosting Sendur X, and their delicious protein supplements, Weapons Grade Whey, and the plant-based Powerplex. If you would like to feel the Fizzy Vantage, head over to fizzyvantage.com and use code NUGGET15 at checkout to save 15% off any full-priced nutrition product. That's NUGGET15 at checkout, and you can find a direct link to this coupon right there in the description of this episode. And now, back to the show. I was going to ask you earlier, you work so much. I mean, you're one of those people that just makes me feel lazy. Like you just, I mean, the YouTube channel and the blog, and you're putting out books, and you're, pretty consistent engaging with people on social media. And I'm always just like, Jesus, how does this guy have the time? It's very impressive and aspirational. You've got a family as well. You mentioned earlier that you either climb or work, and you're always doing something. Do you ever have the need for just a do nothing day? Like, do you ever just set aside a Saturday or a Tuesday or any day of the week just to really not have anything on your agenda? You don't go climbing. you're deciding not to work that day, you just have like a full on restful recovery day. Do you ever do that?
Uh, Not really. I'm ashamed to say because those things are quite important, and I should do that more often.
Why do you say you should?
Because I think it's good for longevity. I think it's good for maintaining health. Um, and it's one of the most significant challenges I have in my life now is actually managing workload, just total workload. Uh, I love all the things that I do. Like, um, I still climb a lot, and I'd love to climb even more than I do. Um, and I love writing books, and I love doing YouTube. It's all brilliant fun. But I could do nothing but any one of those single things. So trying to do them all is kind of tricky, and it's not. And I do struggle with it. So I do find it hard to have time to just have any days of like not particularly scheduled. But I do have wee bits of that here and there. Um, so like you can see my guitar behind me there. I've been trying to learn guitar. So like all day today, for example, um, I've been just finishing off recording the audio version of my book. So I've been editing that and producing it. Um, but every so often, I'll just like play the guitar for 10 minutes.
Mm,
So I don't do it for a whole day, but I've done that maybe 5 times today.
okay.
So there's little short breaks. Um, the other thing that helps me a lot is just living where I do. Like I'm always saying to anyone who'll listen, like if you're a climber, try and live in the mountains if you can. It's very good for you. So like today, I mean, I'm knackered today because I had a big day trying a new route yesterday, and I'm totally exhausted. Um, but today was a nice sunny day. I wasn't out climbing, but I just took 5 minutes just to look out the window and admire the beautiful view of the mountains.
Mm,
And just doing that is a lot better than nothing.
mm,
And in my book, actually, I was talking about the period we mentioned earlier, where I was doing that training the year before I did Rhapsody, and I was doing fingerboard and endurance work and running every day. But one of the things I did was I was doing these 40-minute low intensity endurance circuits, and then I was resting for about the same time. So I'd like sit in the grass for about 40 minutes in between the sets. And I didn't have like that was 2005, so that was before smartphones. So I actually just sat without anything. I didn't have a book or a phone or anything like that. I just watched the river,
wow.
and it was just quiet time. And I just daydreamed. And the more I did that, the better I felt. And I felt that I was recovering well from the training. And I remember being worried. And you asked me about this in our previous podcast episode. You were like, training on the fingerboard 6 days a week. And I worried about that at the time. It's like, am I just overcooking this? But although I was doing so much training, like with every week that went by, it actually felt easier. I mean, I suppose like I was in my mid 20s at that time, I could absorb a fair bit of training. But still, I still think that having that quiet, relaxing time and a relatively simple life. So in the book, I've got a whole chapter on that period, and I was saying that um, I'd get up in the morning and I had this window bay with a ledge that you could sit on. So I used to get up at 10 a.m. I'd sleep till I woke up, no alarm, um, and then I would drink tea for as long as I felt like until the mid-afternoon before I would go climbing. So I would just sit on the window bay seat and just think about projects.
Mm,
And I'd just daydream for like at least an hour. And then I would have the endurance circuits in the late afternoon. And I would have all the sitting daydreaming time in between those circuits. And then I would go out running in the evening, but it was like a shuffle, it was super gentle pace. And I was just like, just daydreaming. So I was saying every day had 3 hours of daydreaming, and I do think it was very good for me. So you've
yeah.
totally hit on like I think what is my biggest weakness in my routine right now is lack of time to do that.
Yeah. It is so hard. It's getting so hard to do that. I mean, I mean, for me, just being later in life and having my own business now and all these things, for you having your hands in so many things, but also just societally, we have, every every single person who's trying to get their slice of the pie is grasping at our attention every moment of the
Yeah,
day, and
yeah,
and I mean that's what I'm contributing to that too. I want you guys to listen to my podcast. So
yeah,
don't go sit in the grass, listen to the nugget instead. And there's just like
yeah.
it's so hard to carve out that kind of time. And I have a lot of room for improvement there too. I try to, at baseline, go on a few walks every day.
Hmm.
It's easier or harder depending on where I am and kind of the season I'm in. It's really easy here in Waco because I camp at the campground, and then you can just walk into the desert. Just within a few steps, you're just out in the middle of nowhere. It's beautiful and it's pretty easy
Hmm.
back in Washington, but it's a lot harder when I'm in Colorado visiting my girlfriend, or it's harder in, certain climbing areas and stuff. And something I wanted to ask you about is, with all your injuries and with your curiosity that you have that's led you to deep dive on so many different topics, it's so easy to overwhelm yourself with all of the great positive things you could be doing, whether it's prehab and injury prevention stuff. It doesn't seem like you do a ton of weightlifting or like mobility routines and stuff. I have a hard time with like sticking to a flexibility routine, even though I know it would probably help my climbing. I just don't really enjoy it. And it's the
Hmm.
first thing to go whenever I get busy.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, then there's like meditation practices and journaling and supplements that we should be taking or not taking. And, you know, uh, putting on your blue light blockers at night, that it just protocols and all these like health promoting things that can help us get back to something that's a little bit more normal for humans, than
Yeah.
our society. But it can all feel so overwhelming. I definitely can drift into this mindset of like to-do list overwhelm. I've got to check off all my little boxes throughout the day, and then invariably, if I'm in that mindset, if I don't escape it and kind of like recenter, I'll just kind of hit the fuck it button after a while, and I'm like, screw
Yeah.
all of this. I'm just gonna live my life, and I'm really good at sticking to climbing because I love climbing, and that doesn't
Hmm.
feel like a to-do list. It just feels like what I want to do. But um, I guess what I'm asking is, do you struggle with that? And are there any things that you intentionally don't do that may or may not be beneficial, but you're just like, you know what? It's just too much. I'm not going to stress about it. I'm just going to keep things simple. And on the
Mm.
flip side, are there any things that do make the cut for you, that you try to be consistent with, that are,
Mm.
whatever, health promoting lifestyle sorts of things?
Mm. Yeah, I totally agree with you that these all these things that you feel pressure to do can start to become a stress in themselves, and a source of guilt almost, that you feel like you should be doing all these things, and somehow other people manage to do them, and like why can't you as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like that person on Instagram could do the splits and they meditate for an hour every day. Like, how do they do that? Um, so yeah, I struggle with the same thing, but I don't worry about it that much. In part because I know that there are many ways to get to the same place with training and health, I think. So I remember a friend actually years ago uh, who he's actually just written a good book as well called Out of Mind. Um, and he likes being outside in the mountains a lot. He doesn't really climb all that much. But he does a lot of music and he does a bit of meditation, and he's actually got really into doing uh, barefoot running in the forest. And he wrote this book about it because it helped him to recover from post-traumatic stress disorder that he had from some really traumatic events in his life. But I remember him asking me years ago at the crag, he said, "Do you meditate, Dave?" And I was like, "No, I don't. I don't sit down and meditate." But I somehow felt, I feel like I do meditate. And I thought, yeah, actually, I feel like the climbing is a meditation. The just going climbing allows me to be in the present, and it's not necessarily always the actual doing moves. it can be. I think a bouldering session can be a meditation session if you approach it in the right way. If I think if you're like, oh, I want to send this problem before I have to leave on the trip, that's maybe not meditation. But if you're like what I was describing earlier, of being lost in the problem solving process of like working out moves, a few hours can pass and you can be doing this fatiguing activity, but you don't notice you're getting tired. It just feels wonderful. And that to me does feel like meditation. Or sometimes it can be just being in the mountains. Like yesterday, I was shivering on a beeley, but I was like watching the light on the mountain opposite as the sun was turning orange and then going down and then watching it all turn to purple as it was getting dark. And that felt like a meditation.
Hmm.
Especially I was because I was on this belay for a few hours and I was getting colder and colder and starting to shiver and you can feel your core temperature going down and I'm trying to detach from my body in a way. So that's a meditation. So I don't beat myself up for not meditating when I kind of am doing it in a different way.
Yeah.
So a lot of these tactics are like hacks to get around the unhealthiness of a Western lifestyle.
Right.
But if you're not living that Western lifestyle, then you don't have the problem to solve in the first place.
Mm.
So you were saying like, how do I manage to fit in all this work and do all these things? But it's nothing that impressive. It's just that I've sort of organized things to be quite like well streamlined. Like I've got a good setup at home. I get up in the morning, I make breakfast for my daughter. She goes out to school at 8 o'clock, and then at 8:10, I'm at my computer, uh, writing a book or editing a YouTube video. And then I've got the entire day to choose when I want to train, and I can go out to my board, and have a great training session on a really good, well thought out board. It's very high quality. And then, I live in the mountains. It's really dark and really quiet here. So when I go to bed, I have really high quality sleep.
Mm.
So everything's quite well set up to work for you. And you really have to fuck it up to like, not do kind of, that's what you want, is to set up your training, your whole environment to make it hard to fail.
Mm.
Um, and I've got all this great bouldering and new routes to do all around me. So I can drive for half an hour or an hour and go to a really beautiful, quiet place where there's no people and there's lots of unclimbed rock that's all brilliant. And I can have a fantastic day, but then be home for tea or come
Mm.
home and do 5 hours more work. So it's not as difficult as it as it looks in a way.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I just kind of keep it pretty simple. Um, yeah. And then not I would recommend not answering your email. That's a good way forward as well.
Man, I tell you what, I have fully adopted your philosophy with that. Not that I took it from you because I don't think we've talked about this before, but man, when the podcast started to take off, I
Mm.
just got buried, by the emails and the correspondence and feeling like every single person that reached out to me was an obligation that I had to get back to them and write something
Yeah.
thoughtful right away. And, or like opportunities, I had to, really think about them before saying no or responding. And I think it was my sister that recommended 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman.
Oh
Have you read
yeah.
that book?
I haven't, but I've read. There's another book by Oliver Burkeman that I have read called The Antidote, which if you haven't
Mm,
read it, I really recommend it. It's an excellent
okay.
read. Yeah.
Awesome. We'll swap Oliver Berkman
Yep.
recommendations. But yeah, I've recommended on the show before, and I'll check out Antidote. But yeah, 4,000 Weeks is essentially just a book that gives you permission to not be on top of your email.
Hmm. Yeah.
And it's obviously it's a full book, so there's a lot more in it, but it kind of gave me permission to, rather than like a productivity book that's like how you can stay on top of everything and get more done and be awesome. It was like, you know what? You're never going to be on top of your email.
Yeah.
Being really good at email just generates more email. So just
Yeah.
stop trying. Just practice getting comfortable with the feeling of not being on top of your email. And it was kind of a paradigm shift for me. And I've really embraced that. Sorry for everyone who sent me emails that I never responded to or that I responded to months and months later. But oh my God, it made such a big difference to just be okay with only answering my email when I feel like it, which is usually less than twice a week. It's once or
Yeah,
twice a week, or sometimes less than that. So, but yeah, I mean, it is so easy. This is kind of like the great paradox of success, I guess, or having a business that is working, is that it's so easy for all the things that come with that to bury you and to take away
yeah,
from the very thing that was working in the first place. And yeah, I mean, the longer I do it, the more I'm kind of just doubling down, like just caring less about getting
yeah,
back to everybody. Or yeah, I've like definitely passed by some probably good opportunities, and I just didn't have the
yeah,
bandwidth, and it wasn't my priority. And I didn't ask
totally.
for someone to
Yeah,
reach out to me, and so too bad,
yeah.
so sad.
And
But
I constantly say to myself, one thing at a time.
one thing at a time.
So
That's
yeah, it's
great.
like I'm publishing a book, and then I'm doing something else. So
Mm,
like the last 2 weeks I've been recording this audiobook and getting things coming through, and it's like one thing at a time. I'm like almost finished this, and then I'll do those other things. And that
mm,
that really helps, just saying that. And because for a while I did try to do the kind of a bit of this and a bit of that all the time, but yeah, just I just found that my quality of work declined across everything,
mm.
and I got less done. And I tend to work better if I just do one thing as well as I can, and then move on to the next thing and give that my whole focus.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. So,
also equally remembering that, well, why am I self-employed in the first place? It's so that I can have my priority is to have the freedom to go climbing on any dry day.
mm,
And if I don't have that, then what's the point?
yeah. Yeah, that's great. When you were writing your book, like, what do you do with all your other stuff when you're immersed in a project like that? Like, I actually didn't pay close enough attention to know the answer to this, but does your YouTube channel sit idle for a while, or do you work ahead of time to have a few episodes or videos scheduled so that you're keeping things ticking over? Like, are you comfortable with just letting some things just sit dormant for a while? Because I mean, writing a book, I mean, what? It's been a 2-year project or something, year and a half,
Yeah, 3 years actually.
three
Yeah,
years.
but I wasn't working on it continuously. So actually writing it, I wrote big sections of it in quite concentrated periods,
Mm,
and then I had sections where I kind of just did a little bit but didn't make much progress. And then I had a whole year with the editor editing it, going back and forward, and it really developed it loads, and that was much more intense
mm,
and regular, and so that took a lot of time. So I was still doing YouTube videos, but just not very often. So I think when I'm not doing anything else, I can just about manage a video a week. Um, but for a lot of the last 2 years, I've just been doing a video a month, and sometimes less than that. But I think a couple of times in the last 2 years, it's been 3 months. I've gone past when I've not done anything. And the last few months, I've just done like one a month. And I've got a list as long as your arm of episodes I want to do.
mm,
Um, but what I'm also realizing with my own channel is that the videos that have the most impact are are often, not always, but often the ones where I do actually put some proper research in, and they're quite sort of information heavy, um, and they take a lot of work to prepare. So it's better if I just when I've got time, I do that work and then I publish them, and the frequency is less, and that maybe doesn't play the game in the way that social media would like you to play it, but I think it's better overall. So possibly if I'd forced myself to churn out a poorer quality video once a week, it might have been better in one way, in that I might have more followers on YouTube.
mm.
Um, but it's not really what I want to do. So there is going to be a trade-off there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it was important to do things like books. I think they are really really good. And one important thing is that the previous two books that I wrote have actually, well, they've given me an income, which has given me the freedom to have a YouTube channel in the first place.
Mm.
So it is sort of important to do all these other projects and to make time for them.
Do people still read books?
People still read books.
That's
Yeah.
good to know. I'm kind of
Yeah.
asking that tongue in cheek, but I mean, I'm kind of serious too, because, for folks that have listened to the podcast for a long time, they will have
Mhm.
heard me say this before, but the impetus for doing the Nugget was Tim Ferriss's book, Tools of Titans. And I
Yes.
imagined at the start that I was going to put together a kind of Tools of Titans, um, book focused on climbing performance and living a balanced, like rich life within climbing. And I thought the podcast would be the way that I did research for that book.
Hmm.
And the longer I've been doing the podcast, and as it's kind of naturally evolved, and as my curiosity has, evolved, I don't know. I just have kind of lost the fire for that specific project, and it doesn't really feel like it would add a lot of value because obviously I'm filtering through my own lens, but like I thought Tools of Titans was amazing, and yet I love podcasts. So when I really want to revisit a topic or a specific guest from Tim, I just go re-listen to that episode, and I get a
Yeah.
lot out of, that sort of interaction. It's just so unfiltered and raw and real. I really appreciate that, and I connect with it, and I can, listen to it while I'm driving or whatever. Um, so yeah, it's encouraging to know that people are still reading books. Do you think it's a different audience? Like, does it connect with a different type of learner than your YouTube channel or these other things
I
that you do?
I'm not sure I can answer that. I don't know.
Mm,
I've not sort of collected any. I've not even thought about that or even would know how I would find out
yeah.
if it's a different audience. But I wouldn't think so. I don't have anything to lead me to think that it would be. Um, but it's interesting especially with my first book, 9 out of 10 Climbers. Um, people oft like I'm surprised with the number of people who say that they go back and refer to it every year
Mm,
when they just have a kind of um, yearly appraisal of how things are going in their climbing, and they
yeah.
go back and look at it again, and they say that they pick up something else or something that didn't apply to them in a way in the past. They pick up and they think, oh yeah, I'm doing that, and I should do more of it, or I should do less of it, or change how I think about it. Yeah,
Yeah.
so that book seems to be something that people just did, and it's also the format of that book was written because that was at the time when I was doing lots of blogging. So I was writing these blog posts that were between one and 4 paragraphs long. So 9 out of 10's arranged like that. It's almost like as a series of blog posts. So it's
Mm,
like short snippets that are you can just dip into it and read a little bit, and you have these take home messages. It was meant to be like that, quite off the cuff, quite sort of hard hitting. To because it's almost like a behavioral science book. A lot of things we've been talking about tonight, just habits and ways of thinking about things that start to dictate the behavior that you act out on a consistent basis, and that's what determines your trajectory as a climber.
yeah.
So yeah, definitely, it definitely still appeals, and people still buy 9 out of 10 Climbers now and read it frequently. I thought that book is a very simple book, and I thought it would be almost irrelevant in 10 years after I wrote it. But I actually think it's more relevant now than it was
Mm,
because so I wrote that book in 2009, and that was just at this period where before that there was very little information on training for climbing, and then after that there was just more and more and more, and now
right.
it's just overload of like stuff, and now it's like everyone's writing to me saying like, this guy says do hangboarding twice a day. This guy says no, do max hangs, and like there's all these people with all this different advice, and everyone's trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
So now overabundance is the problem, but also the way social media works is it constantly tries to present ideas as being new and dramatic and exciting, and
Yeah.
it's like grab my attention with this new idea. So sometimes the boring basics can get forgotten about or lost, and so that always creates an opportunity for any climber who is able to buck that trend and stay focused on the basics.
Mm,
Um, so I actually think that book is it's almost more important because that's what it tries to come back to as like basic principles. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I've often thought, as I've kind of revisited this idea of my own book many times over the years, I've thought like, well, maybe the value, maybe I shouldn't even think about it as being a collection of helpful advice for other people because, like you said, the advice just changes so often and it's overwhelming how much there is. So I don't want to add to that. But
Hmm.
maybe the value would be in the synthesis, like the process of revisiting all these conversations I've had and really trying to distill down to, one or two or three or five really time tested, tried and true nuggets, that are helpful.
Yeah.
Um, has that been the case for you? Like, what have you gotten out of writing these different books that you've put out?
Well, just reflection. I mean, the main thing is, well, especially for my latest book, because that is autobiographical. It's like trying to make sense of stories that are in my head. That because everyone has their bias, like your own experience is like a version of reality, if you like. And I'm just the same as everyone else in that boat. And so, as I was actually writing about my own climbing, um, that was one of the things that we went through when I was editing it and going back and forward with my editor. Is that I was suddenly starting to realize that the story of my own climbing was not quite what I thought it was, or
Oh,
or that I didn't really know how to interpret things. Um,
can you elaborate on that?
yeah, yeah. So to give an example, um, I was talking about uh, the final stages where I was trying to finish off Rhapsody. If anyone's ever seen the film E11 when I'm trying that route, I was working on it for a long time, trying to top rope it, and then I had this whole season when I was taking all these massive falls off it, falling off the last move, had various struggles with holes breaking and all that. Ran out of conditions and it went through the winter, and then I came back the following spring, and then just started falling off it again. So I was really struggling to get it over the line, and I felt like I was already at my limit. I mean, I think that's what made that route interesting, really. Um, so I was trying to look back at my own story from that experience and think, well, what was it that did get it over the line? And there's actually several possibilities, and I'm not certain which is the correct one, or maybe it's all of them. So there's one view that um, I was just making incremental progress. I was on that curve. I was on the kind of flat end of the curve where I was doing pretty well on all the factors. And so I needed a lot of time to make a very small improvement, but I only needed a small improvement to get a couple of moves further, and then it was done. So all I did was go through the motions and then get to the end. So that's one way of thinking about it. The other way was that um, I kept on falling off the last move. And the day before I did the climb, I took a 15-foot length of rope and I just absoled over the top. And I just spent 2 hours going, right, the last move. Can I find anything different to do? And I just, in the end, used a foothold that was so bad that when you do the move on its own, you would barely notice the difference. And it's not even a difficult move on its own. But the very next time on the lead, I did stick that move and finish the route.
Mm.
So possibly the message was, the sequence, the detail of the movement, attention to detail with movement technique is so important. But then there was another thing that was funny about the route. It was almost like a running joke between me and my wife, Claire. We always said, "Oh, all we need is for Claire to come and Beeley, and I'll send my project." Because it did happen several times, and then it happened with Rhapsody. So although we lived 10 minutes walk away from the crag, on nearly all the time that I was trying Rhapsody, Claire had never belayed me on that route. Um, and the first time she did was after I'd had all the falls, and I came back to it the following spring. And it was quite early in the season, not many other climbers around. So I asked Claire to give me a belay, and then I linked it first try. I thought, wow, right, okay, I'm like nearly there again. Um, and then she belayed me on the lead, and I just did it. Uh, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought, yeah, it's like if I go, we used to have this running joke because on several hard routes that I'd been trying, Claire would come and belay me, and then I would just do the routes like kind of easily. And And then I thought, maybe it's not a joke. Maybe it's actually a real effect. And and I think the effect is that, when your partner who knows you inside out, um, they can be completely honest with you, and there's a lot of communication between you that happens without saying anything. And so one of the things that I draw attention to in the book was the actual, right before I had the attempt on Rhapsody, where I actually succeeded. Claire was there, and I was like running around organizing gear because it had been raining and snowing, and it had been really wet. But then the sun came out, but it was almost about to get dark, so there was a bit of a mad rush to get everything ready. And I just remember like scuttering about, and Claire just stood there, just silent, just watching me, not saying anything. And it's such a contrast because often other climbing partners would talk a lot or almost like fuss a little bit.
Mm.
Um, and they were just being encouraging. Nothing wrong with that. But Claire would just say nothing. And that just connected really well with me, because I felt like if there was something that needed corrected, Claire would always say, and she would often say in quite an uncompromising manner that only like someone who's your wife can actually say. Um, so I always felt like, well, if she's saying nothing, she's just standing watching me do this, I must be ready. And I remember just having this feeling as I was starting up the route that everything's just normal. And I just felt just that little bit more relaxed. And I was thinking, well, maybe that just allowed me to just save a little bit of energy that I needed for the last move.
Mm.
And maybe that was the effect that happened over and over and over again on a whole series of projects, but I
Mm.
hadn't really attributed it properly. So writing the book was a great way to distill things out of my own experience that came to light only when I did actually synthesize them, and also further came to light when my editor actually challenged me on some of the things. There were some points that I made kind of in passing that she said, like, is that really true? And it made me realize that I needed to put more emphasis on it, or it made me realize that I hadn't sort of thought something through properly. So I think writing a book is a very distilled collection of thoughts or ideas. Um, so that's very good because it forces you to refine everything, and especially if you work with an editor, it forces your ideas to be challenged. But I think that's possibly one of the limitations of podcasts. Like I listen to a lot of podcasts as well, and you know how you get podcasts that run on certain themes. Like say you might listen to a podcast on um, training methods, or environmentalism or agriculture or
Sure.
some
Yeah.
subject, and often the podcast hosts invite guests who generally agree with them
Mm.
or have a
Hmm.
similar outlook. And you think what this podcast really needs as an outsider looking in is someone to challenge the ideas instead of like someone to agree with them all the time. So
Hmm.
one thing about writing a book is it helps you to expose yourself to more challenges as you're actually preparing it. And then that usually refines the ideas. So I think that's that, and social media lacks that a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, having said that, I will caveat that by saying social media also has comments that challenge you as
Oh
well.
yeah,
So
you get
it
you
can
get
be good
plenty
in
of
that way.
pushback, but it's it's
Yeah,
not this not necessarily the same as a thoughtful editor who's on your side saying like,
yeah,
"Hey, this is a strong point. Either defend it more, or are you sure about this?" Or
yeah.
yeah, yeah. That sounds like a really special connection and relationship. How did you connect with that editor?
Um, well, in part because she's a good climber and had done some great work before. So she'd edited a couple of great books on some other Scottish climbers. One of them being Hamish McInnes, who was one of the absolute legends of Scottish mountaineering. So I actually knew of the books that she'd edited by reputation because people had said those are really good books. And then when I read them, I thought, yeah, they are. They're really well put together. So she edited those. So um, I just went to meet with her and bounced ideas about the book, and yeah, I thought, yeah, that would be a really good process to work
Mm.
through. Yeah, and it was great. I think it was good to have someone that will challenge you a bit on the ideas and have a bit of pushback. Yeah, because I go through there's different layers. Like a big layer of a theme in my book is about confidence, and I talk a lot about um, growing up and being a very timid uh, kid who was very shy, introverted, not confident uh, about like myself really, and climbing gave me confidence very slowly. I built it up very, very slowly, um, and I think that was really good for me. So, in a position of lack of confidence, I built movement skill piece by piece, and I built a relationship with training piece by piece, and then I got strength, and then I got confidence last.
Mm.
And where I went wrong in my climbing was where I described earlier, where I was taking some really nasty falls, was where I actually when I started to go off that path and get confidence too early.
Mm.
That was usually when things went badly in my climbing.
Yeah.
But one of the things that my editor was really pointing out was she was saying that in a lot of the stories in the book, I'm desperately trying to avoid conflict with other people.
Oh.
And yet, when I was describing climbing, I was describing it in terms of conflict. Like I was saying, like I attacked the crux, like like the route was trying to kill me. Like I was describing doing my first E9. It was just like no gear, And I just thought, this is survival. This is a route called hold fast. And I always remember the last move, like you had to slap for this crimp, and it always like a split second before my fingers would get to the crimp, my foot would slip off the smear.
Mm.
So you had to just get the crimp so fast before you would actually just fall off. And so that's where the name Hold Fast came from. Um, but I remember starting up it and just being like, this is a battle of survival. Like, if I don't kill the climb will kill me kind of thing. That's the mindset that I built myself up into. So
Mm.
that was very much part of my psyche in approaching climbs, but completely different to the way I approached interactions with people. And she
Mm.
found that really interesting, and so did I. And so it made me think a lot deeper about myself and my whole life and how I ended up having an approach to life and to climbing.
Mm. Oh, that's so cool. It's definitely making me want to read the book. So good job. I'm excited to get a copy of it. I'll order that, I think, as soon as we get off here today. I haven't gotten around to it yet, but I've been meaning to. Um, does it make sense to pivot to diet? How are you feeling on time? Do you need
Certainly,
a
yeah.
break?
Yeah.
Okay,
Might take a loo break for 2 seconds and
let's do it.
come back for, yeah, right,
All
back
right,
in a dick.
we'll be right back. Hey friends, I want to tell you about my new portable hangboard that I designed in collaboration with Frictitious Climbing. It's called the Nug. It's available now. I'm really proud of how it turned out, and I'm excited to share it with all of you. It's super portable. It weighs less than one climbing shoe, and it has all of the hold sizes that I personally use for my finger training. It's the only thing I use for finger training these days, aside from climbing, and it's working really well. I usually do a few finger curls with it in a couple different grip positions before I climb. I can do it anywhere at the gym or outside at the boulders or the crag. And it's really helped me be super consistent with my finger training, and consistency is king. You can check it out at frictitiousclimbing.com, or you can get there through my website at thenuggetclimbing.com. Just look for the Nug at the top of the page. I hope you check out the Nug, and happy finger training. This episode is brought to you by Tindeck. The Tindeck Progressor is one of the most useful training tools I own. I use it with the Nug all the time, and it's super duper handy. What is it? The Tyndek Progressor is a digital force gauge that you can sync to your phone with Bluetooth to measure your finger strength. You can use it for other exercises too, but I mostly use it for my fingers. The Tyndek looks like a little block with a couple of holes in it. You can attach it to the Nug or another portable hangboard. All you need is a couple of carabiners, a sling, and your Tyndek, and you can do legitimate finger training anywhere. I use it for my finger training before I climb, and I love being able to see how my numbers look and how my fingers are progressing over time. Go to Tyndek.com and use code NUGGET to save $10 off anything in their shop. That's TINDEQ.com and use NUGGET at checkout to save $10 off your order. Train your fingers anywhere with Tyndek. And now, back to the show.
Hey, good stuff.
What's that? Sorry?
Drinking lots of tea today.
Nice.
Recovery from yesterday's new route attempt, which unfortunately ended in failure.
Your yesterday's what attempt? Sorry, say that again.
A new route attempt.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry to hear that it ended in failure. What is the injury that you're working through right now?
Oh, I've done something to my sesamoid bone in my big toe.
Okay.
And it's fine like walking on the flat, but when I wear rock shoes and I extend my toe back, it's really painful. So I've just not been able to wear my rock shoe at all. So I've not been climbing, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to start quite soon. But it's been quite good timing, really, because I've had so much work to do book publishing and get all that over the line, and that's just drawing to a close now, hopefully. So yeah, that's all right.
All right. Yeah, I hope you're on the mend and back to rock climbing soon. Hope you can get after some boulder project this winter. All right. Okay, diving back in. So I think I'll start by I should start by asking you what your diet looks like these days. People are always curious. You're always doing experiments. The last time we talked, you had a kind of a default, which was, ketogenic, very low carb, still kind of carnivore-ish, but including some greens. Has that changed? What's your default these days?
I would say that's still my default, and I have broadly followed that. But actually, in the past 6 months or so, I need to look at my diary to see exactly when I shifted. But I thought I would experiment a bit more with just eating more of a general Western diet again, and just see how I feel. I've done that several times, just because I'm like, I wonder what would happen if I just started eating a Western diet again. So I did that, and I wouldn't. I still don't recommend it. It's not very good. I do not feel good at all. So I think it's the biggest effect is on mood. I just feel like a much lower mood, and it's quite a marked effect actually. So it's not. I'm not gonna stick to that. I'm gonna go back to probably. I think it's like quite a strict ketogenic diet, because I just feel so much better on that. So yeah, I'll probably return to that, because I'm fed up of not feeling good, like mental health wise.
That's interesting. You're fed up with it. Did you set out to do this for like a set period of time?
No, not really. Just to see, because one of the other interesting effects of my various diet experiments is I used to have quite bad eczema on my feet. And I definitely noticed that diet experiments had a huge effect on that. The first time I noticed it was with fasting, and then it just cleared up like almost instantly. I was like, oh, okay, well, some could be something gut related going on here. But then it just returned as soon as I stopped fasting. But then it was the carnivore diet that first time I stopped eating any plant foods for a spell, it disappeared in a couple of days. But then I managed to put it into remission, so I was able to go back to eating a slightly more varied diet, and I could handle eating vegetables, fruits, grains, things like that. Um, and the eczema didn't come back, but then gradually it did. Well, actually, I did another experiment where I was eating like an almost vegan diet, like really lots of vegetables, like 80% carb, mostly vegetables, potatoes and things like lentils and things like that. And my eczema did come back from that. Um, once I stopped that, it gradually recovered and went away. But I was curious to see with a Western diet would it come back, and it has, but only a tiny bit.
Hmm.
So it's that is really interesting to me that these sort of skin conditions, which may have an autoimmune basis or contribution, um, they seem to be almost like on a knife edge, and there's something to do with it may be something to do with the gut. I'm not sure, but something to do with the actual integrity of the gut barrier, or
It sure seems like it. Yeah.
yeah, or the
Like that's a
composition
factor.
of the gut flora, or
Hmm.
both
Yeah.
interacting with each other. Something about that is changing with the changes in diet that then has a lasting effect that can kind of go in either direction. So once the condition gets going, it can be hard to shift. But
Hmm.
if you manage to get it into remission, it can stay there, even if you return to the diet that maybe contributed to it in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was also one of the reasons why I thought I would kind of go back to it as well,
Okay.
just to
Um,
see.
I'm glad
Yeah,
to hear it went back into remission again because I think the last time we talked, you had just recently done that vegetarian diet
yeah,
experiment and you had not managed to get the eczema to go away again. It was just
yeah,
like, oh shit, is this like here to stay this time? Or
yeah,
so,
yeah.
yeah, just took some time, it sounds like.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so that's been pretty good. Yeah, but I will definitely return to um, either ketogenic or carnivore, close to carnivore diet, because that's where I felt overall the best um, in terms of mood and in terms of health and physical performance.
Yeah.
Have all felt really good, and I just I just like feeling. I think when you felt really good, then you just want that back.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I relate to the mood thing. It's really interesting. I mean, it's so easy to normalize to it and to not notice it until you have
Hmm.
that contrast. But
Yeah.
I've been on kind of variations of a paleo diet since about 2017. That's when I started experimenting with different dietary approaches. And it started with the Tim Ferriss slow carb diet and then keto and then paleo.
Hmm.
And I've kind of tried, a variety of different things over the years and kind of settled on autoimmune paleo. Um, for the last year, I've mostly been following like a meat and fruit diet.
Hmm.
Um, I I've listened to and watched a lot of Paul Saladino's work. I'm actually curious to ask you about him and your thoughts on fruit in a minute here, but I'm doing that for psoriasis. You and I have talked about this before, but I've had psoriasis since I was like 13 years old or so. And uh, I did not feel great when I went strict carnivore. I just
Hmm.
felt my digestion wasn't as good. I felt like something was missing. I felt like I had cravings and just didn't feel totally satisfied. And
Yeah.
even just adding, you know, a few pieces of fruit throughout the day
Hmm.
is like night and day. Like that feels infinitely sustainable for me, whereas strict carnivore does not. But with both of those instances, my psoriasis pretty quickly cleared up like 80 or 90%, but I
Hmm.
haven't managed to ever get that last 10%. And I think
Mm.
there's, a number of other factors. I don't think it's just food. I think I need to work on moving my lymph and detox stuff. And maybe it's many years of exposure to microplastics could be a thing. I've been learning more about that. And there's just so much to get into. Um, but anyway, the point I was starting to make is that there have been several times over the last few years that I've deviated from that diet and just kind of said like, fuck it. I'm kind of tired of being this restrictive. I'm going to go back to
Yeah.
maybe I'm overthinking all this. I'm just going to go try eating normally Western diet, including more, tortillas and beans and lentils and veggies and, nothing like super processed and unhealthy, but just a wider variety of normal foods. Um, and I've noticed the mood thing, and I don't get down necessarily. It's not, I wouldn't call it like depression, although maybe it
Hmm.
is. It's just, I just feel less excited about stuff. I've really
Mm.
noticed that when I deviate and add more Western diet, foods into my diet, or go out for a big meal and do that a couple times during a week, like go out to a restaurant a couple times because friends are in town or something. I'll just care a little bit less about stuff that I'm normally pretty excited about.
Mm.
It just adds almost like a cloud cover to life
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
way where things just are a little less bright, which I guess I'm describing what depression is. But yeah, I don't know if that was my baseline before and I just never really
Hmm.
noticed it or just thought that those were normal fluctuations in mood. But yeah, once you start doing those experiments, it's like, oh, it's kind of clockwork. Every time I eat this,
Yep.
I feel less good. And when I am pretty tight with my autoimmune paleo diet, I feel really excited about life and I feel good about things. So,
Yeah, I
yeah.
can relate. I feel very much the same. Yeah. One thing to add about the skin conditions is the other thing that can interact with it is just stress, psychological stress.
Yeah.
That's a huge trigger for me. So,
Mm,
you know, it's when you're interpreting these things, it's tricky. Like you've got to have in mind other contributors that you either know about or always keep in mind that possibly they could be there in the background, things that you don't really know that are contributors. And that could be exposures to all sorts of things in the environment. But for me, it's like you can have the diet changes can have one effect that's beneficial, but that actually might be counteracted by psychological stress. Or if the diet effect is negative, it may only be very mild, but then you combine it with psychological stress and it becomes quite serious all of a sudden.
mm,
That's been the way it certainly worked out for me.
yeah. Yeah, I know. I think, thinking back to your comments about sitting in the grass for 40 minutes. Yeah, I that hit me pretty hard when you said that. I'm like, oh, I need more of that in my life. I think that'd
Yeah.
be so helpful. Just having like a baseline of that every day would be amazing, and
Mhm.
probably would have a noticeable effect on my skin and a number of other things.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
want to ask you about fruit. So I've been a
Hmm.
fan and just curious about this guy, Paul Saladino, for a number of years. For people that don't know, he's an MD, a medical doctor by training. I think he did his residency in cardiology. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's true. But he had pretty severe eczema, honestly, kind of similar to your story. Started doing diet experiments during residency because he realized, no one in medicine was really talking about root cause of skin stuff. And he was a carnivore enthusiast for a long time. He was like the carnivore MD on his socials and everything and built a pretty big following. And then eventually started to have side effects from being ketogenic for a long period of time. I think he was strict carnivore keto for a year or year and a half or something like that. And he started to notice that he would get cold, like his metabolic rate seemed to be dropping. He had trouble with temperature control. His body would feel cold. Maybe I don't know if it's hypo or I guess hypothyroidism, maybe
Yeah.
um, low thyroid. And so he started doing more research and experimenting, and he has since added a lot more fruit to his diet and fruit
Yeah.
juices, even, which was interesting to me because, you grow up, I always heard like, fruit juice is basically the same as a Coca-Cola. Like it's just sugar water. It'll make you fat. Fructose will make you fat. It'll make you want to eat more, all these things. But yeah, now he eats meat, he eats organ meats, he eats raw dairy, he eats a wide variety of fruit, and he gets quite a lot of carbohydrate every day, maybe 250 grams or 300 grams per day. He surfs a lot. He's very active. He lives in Costa Rica. Um, so he's doing a lot of things right. He's a super healthy guy. But it's been interesting to me to to hear him talk about it. Like the idea is meat there's very few things in meat that might trigger some sort of autoimmunity. It's a pretty safe food if you're going to really restrict your diet and try to do an elimination diet and figure out, what's causing your skin to flare up if you have a skin issue or your gut to flare up or whatever.
Yeah.
Fruit is kind of similar. Like it's the part of the plant that I'm putting this in air quotes here, but it's the part of the plant that wants to be eaten because
Yeah.
plants want their fruit to be eaten, so their seeds spread and that's how they, thrive. Whereas eating the roots and the seeds and the stalks have a lot more of these plant defense chemicals, and that's why he avoids vegetables and things along those lines. That's why vegetables can cause more autoimmune triggers for folks that are sensitive. Um, so I've been on this more or less meat and fruit diet for like a year now, and I kind of feel great, but but it hasn't resolved my psoriasis, and I also can't help myself but have like a little bit of a worry in the back of my head. I'm not like totally thriving in the way that I want to, and
Hmm.
I've done some blood work, and I don't know if I should be concerned about LDL. Like my LDL is a little bit elevated, like in the 130s. Um, I'm not quite as lean as I would like to be, but I feel a lot better when I include carbohydrates in my diet. I've tried keto. I feel better when I'm still pretty low carb, but I feel a lot better when I have like 150 or 200 grams of carbs per day than when I'm super low carb.
Hmm.
Um, and fruit seems to be the thing that agrees with me the best.
Hmm.
Having said that, like, do I need to be worried about metabolic health or fatty liver? There's like so many things, right? Like you can kind of I can kind of become a little bit of a hypochondriac with food, and I have a history of disordered eating because this stuff is just so crazy and
Hmm.
complicated, and so
Hmm.
there's that element of it too. I haven't talked about it much on the show, my health journey, because I don't want to encourage people being overly restrictive or just even thinking too hard about food.
Yeah.
Like most climbers just
Yeah.
need to eat more.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's all the context. I'm not trying to get a free coaching session here. I know I've made a lot of this about me. I'm just really curious to hear your thoughts about fruit, if that's something you've experimented with, if you're concerned about fructose at all, or yeah, whatever thoughts you
Yeah.
have.
Well, I mean, broadly, I would say fruit is a healthy thing to eat.
Okay.
That would be the starting place. Like, I would say that um, for most people, if not almost everyone, fruit would be a great thing to continue to eat and wouldn't cause most people many problems. With that said, a ketogenic diet is a particular diet strategy that does require restriction of fruit by definition because it's rich in carbs. So ketogenesis is a unique metabolic state, if you like, which has its sort of own rules
Right.
in a way. So that although fruit is healthy, you can have like you can be healthy eating fruit, but if you need to be ketogenic for some reason, then it would not be a good idea to eat fruit because you have to exclude it by definition.
Right. That
So
might
for
be for
almost everyone,
type 1 diabetics or for people with epilepsy or things
or
like
people who
that.
are using ketogenic diets to treat mental health conditions,
Mm.
or people who are using it to treat eating disorders because they have been successfully used to treat um, two of the eating disorders,
Oh, that's
uh,
interesting.
and or some other condition like obesity. So the ketogenic diet treats a range of weight-related conditions and it treats a range of mental health-related conditions, and there is still early evidence, but growing evidence that it's effective for those. So if you're using it as a therapeutic diet, almost like a medical therapeutic diet, um, then that may be a kind of unique case, if you like, where you would want to restrict fruit. Aside from that, fruit's a very healthy thing to eat. So if you're not eating a ketogenic diet, then have at it with fruit. I'm not worried about fructose intake
Mm.
um, for people who are eating significant amounts of carbohydrate. I
It
don't
seems
think
like a
that's
lot of
a
the research on fructose that makes it look bad is done using high fructose corn syrup, and a lot of it's in animal models, like in rats and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. The animal models are uh, tricky to relate to humans, and also there's um, there's two things to tease apart, which are the metabolic effects of fructose um, within a calorie controlled setting, and then the impact of fructose or fructose containing foods on total calorie intake in an ad libitum situation.
Mm,
So as soon as you control calories, you're sort of putting a hand on the brake, if you like. But what gets people into trouble is if a diet causes you um, to store excess fat or overeat, or usually both, um, then it's bad news, and you would want to intervene to change that.
mm,
Um, so, you know, in your own situation, you were saying you were like, should you be worried about metabolic health? We can come on to LDL in a minute. But you could also look at your liver enzymes over time and see if they are moving in the wrong direction. Uh,
what blood panel would you ask for to check for that?
you would usually just say liver enzymes, and
Okay.
they would give you ALT and GGT.
Okay.
Um, and you could look at them and see if they're in the normal range, but especially if they're what direction they're going in.
Mm,
Um, but waist circumference will also give you a good idea.
hmm
For a lot of men, and I mean maybe this is a slightly peripheral discussion to climbers who are mostly lean, but certainly not exclusively. Um, but a lot of men, as they get older into their middle age, they're quite lean. Sometimes they might even lose muscle, but they're starting to get a belly, especially a hard belly, that visceral fat, and that's when you know you know there's a problem with your diet and or your exercise as well, and that a change of lifestyle is in order to prevent that from
hmm
getting any worse. I always remember once when my daughter was really young, I went on like a package holiday to like a like hot um like destination kind of place. So it was like totally non-climbing holiday. I'd never been on a trip like that before in my life.
hmm
So I came across like a whole hotel full of other like mums and dads in their like 30s or 40s with young kids. And I remember like looking all week and thinking, out of the 300 odd men I saw in that week in that age group, I maybe saw only about five who didn't have a slight belly. And it's like when you
Yeah.
come into contact with the general population, you're like, wow, like
Yeah.
all these people are all en route to poor metabolic health. And you know, it will just tend to get worse unless you
Yeah.
do
Yeah,
something different.
totally. I know.
Yeah.
Once you start noticing that and paying attention to it, not that I'm going through life judging people, but
Mhm.
yeah, it's we're in pretty rough shape, especially here in the United
Mhm.
States. Every time
Yeah.
I go to like
But
an airport, I look around and
oh yeah.
I'm just like, oof, man, if this is America, we're in rough shape here. People are not
Yeah.
looking super
Yeah.
healthy.
It does sound like in America there's a bit of a movement right now politically to start to attack that. I
Yeah.
dare say it might have a shaky start.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
but I'm glad to see it on the agenda at least.
Yeah, totally.
Um, so you
Yeah.
never know, things might change a little bit. Um, who
Yeah.
knows what direction that'll go in, but it's better than nothing, which is what's happening in this country.
Right. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
But
Yeah,
coming
it's
back to meat and fruit, I would say that in general, like a diet of meat and fruit is an excellent diet.
you're not worried
And
about combining saturated fat with more carbs.
no, I'm not. No.
Okay.
Um, and there are sort of natural experiments in a way, very roughly, that confirm that. I mean, there's what's known as the French paradox of the French who do eat some refined carbs. You know, they're eating some baguettes and croissants, like butter and bread together, and have a low. I think their obesity rate is actually falling. I'm
Mm,
sure I saw some data lately to see their obesity rates coming back down again, but it always was very low. Same with Switzerland, eating lots of um, carbs, but also with high fat dairy and plenty of red meat as well, and not really having too much of a problem. So the combination of carbs and saturated fat, I'm not too concerned with. For people who are metabolically healthy,
mm,
I do think there are some people for whom that combination doesn't work very well, but it's usually if it causes them to be hungry and then start to gain weight, and then it's the gaining weight that's the problem.
Mm.
That's certainly the way it goes for me. So when I eat that way, I would tend to gain weight, and I would have to actively start to restrict food intake to stop gaining weight. And then you're into this trade-off between you're either gaining weight with all the problems that comes with that, or you're constantly a little bit hungry and restricting food, and you're getting into all the problems that comes with that. And
Yeah.
that's what leads me down in the direction of the ketogenic diet, because that solves both of those problems at the same time.
Okay.
And so with, I mean, I've followed Paul Saladino's work myself for some years when he was on a carnivore diet, and then his evolution into introducing carbs. And what I always thought, and I'm not alone in this, is that I always worried that um, when Paul was eating a carnivore diet, he was eating, as far as I can gather, quite a high protein version of that diet.
Mm.
And I've heard some others point out that it might have been an equally good experiment to just try adding more fat, and that possibly the reason for Paul having symptoms of low energy availability was simply too much protein and not enough fat on that
Mm.
diet. And it, as an alternative to adding fruit, he might have just added more fatty meat, like, or with higher proportion of fat,
Yeah.
um, in order to be able to eat more energy, and that maybe would have got him to the same place. But as far as I can gather, he's doing quite well.
He seems like it.
So
Yeah.
there's maybe not too much of a problem. Where I slightly, um, when I watch his videos, um, I sometimes slightly object because he presents the idea um, that ketosis is long-term ketosis is not healthy, and that's not reflected in the evidence. And there was a good study done by an English researcher, Isabella Cooper, on women who'd been in ketosis for an average of 4.5 years, and I think the range was from like 2 years up to something silly like 10, 15 years. Um, but almost universally, their metabolic health was excellent, and they reported no problems with low energy availability or feeling cold or excessively low thyroid. Thyroid hormone on a ketogenic diet has to go down as part of the physiological adaptation. That's normal.
Mm.
But if you're eating enough energy, then you shouldn't have problems with feeling cold or feeling not so good. So like all of this is it's kind of experimental, because there's not millions of people doing that diet.
Right.
There's thousands to hundreds. There's maybe hundreds of thousands of people doing it, and there's only maybe a few thousand who are actually documenting it publicly on social media, and there's almost no one studying it scientifically. So
Hmm.
it's kind of tricky to navigate. There's a lot of speculation, and I'm speculating right now. Um, but I kind of wonder if Paul might have got to the same place, like solving those problems by just eating a bit more fat. Um, and when you see people who try a carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet and end up having to bail, it's often because they're just not eating enough fat. So that they just end up taking out all the carbs, and they'll eat like if they do a keto diet, let's say they eat lots of like salad with vegetables that grow above the ground. So they're eating like leafy salad, and they're eating quite lean meat, and that's it.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like all the energy's gone.
Hmm.
So no wonder there's low energy. So you need to add back fat. And the other thing about the ketogenic diet is that it's quite appetite suppressing. So a lot of people run into problems in that if they've been habituated to years of always staying on the lower edge of how much they eat to satiety, then they can end up accidentally undereating.
Mm.
And that's very, very common. So it's important to kind of counsel yourself or be counseled. It's like, eat till you're full, like let your appetite decide when you've had enough, which I think is a healthy thing. It's a good state to be in, and one of the reasons I feel it works so well for me.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I mean, I have no problem with eating uh, meat and fruit if it's working well. But the same with any diet. If it's working really well, then great. And if
Yeah.
it's not working well, then possibly a different experiment is worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all really helpful. Yeah, I often think with Paul, um, it's just like, man, I mean, you're doing so many other things right, like he's spending an hour or two in the cold ocean surfing, getting tons
Hmm.
of sun out in nature every single day. He lives in Costa
Yeah.
Rica. He goes to bed early because it's dark at 5:30. Like he's nailing it on all these other factors. And
Hmm.
um so yeah, I've often thought about that. Like, well, yeah, you've added all this fruit back in or all these carbs back in and your metabolic health is still fantastic, but how attainable is your lifestyle for the rest of us? You know, it's not easy to do all that other stuff. We try to do the best we can, but um so I was going to ask you this. You kind of answered it already, but for you, it sounds like the ketogenic diet is more, or rather, your way of eating is more about specifically trying to be in ketosis versus just focusing on removing the foods that are triggering your eczema. It's
Partly, but also there's a definite effect with appetite. I find that on on a mixed diet, but even eating any carbohydrate, even eating so people when they either nutritionists, dietitians, or just people on social media, when they criticize the ketogenic diet, they often say like, "What the hell can be wrong with an apple,
mm,
or a strawberry, or a
sure.
potato, or a lentil? These are
Yeah.
healthy foods. Like, what's the problem?" No one gains weight on these foods, like gains excess fat. And it's like, yeah, that's true, but that's not seeing the whole picture. I find that if I eat potatoes, lentils, and fruit, then I start on a path where my appetite starts to take off, and I want to eat pizza and cake,
Mm,
like a
mm,
lot, and that derails me, or it either derails my diet, and I start to gain weight, and I start to feel low mood and all the other downstream consequences, or I start to have to deal with the constant voice in my head going, I want to eat cake,
mm.
which I don't want to deal with all the time. Like, um,
That's
just being
really
slightly hungry all the time. It's just no good.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think I'm almost the opposite where when I was keto, and I caveat this, I might just not have been eating enough at the time. But when I was keto or when I tried carnivore, I just felt a little bit insane. Like I was, constantly, buying random keto snack cookies made
Hmm.
with monk fruit or whatever, different
Yeah,
types of like alcohol sweeteners that don't affect your blood sugar and things. Like
yeah,
I felt like I had an itch that I could never quite scratch. And when I've
yeah.
added just a little bit of fruit back in, that went away. And it actually feels
Mm,
easier for me to not grab the cookie or not want to buy a muffin or whatever. So that's really interesting. But
yeah. So that's interesting for me because I've done keto diets, the same thing where you're trying to recreate the sweet, like Western like foods, but
yeah,
on in the context of a keto diet. And I have this that it's a lot more difficult to follow
it doesn't
for me
satisfy.
anyway
It's
when I do that.
yeah.
I do think there are some people who are the opposite, who are like, there's no way I can stick to a keto diet, but if I have a keto diet with um like cheesecake sweetened with allulose, that allows me to adhere to it. And I do think that's fair enough. If that works for you, then that's totally fine. But for me, I think I struggle a bit more with that. And I find that if I'm actually just stricter with it, then all of that sort of craving that you described, feeling a bit insane, that kind of goes away, and
Mhm.
I just feel good on it.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't really like fatty meat. I really struggle to eat a lot of fat in the form of meat. So I usually lean on high fat dairy to get the
Cream.
fat in,
Hmm.
or just and to get the energy in, just because your energy's got to come from somewhere. If you're just eating like a lean steak that's mostly red, you're looking at protein and not a huge amount of fat. Um, so that energy's got to come from somewhere. So for me it's dairy that makes up the difference, and that works well.
Do
So I
you
usually
go ahead? Sorry.
yeah. So on a keto diet, I would eat like meat, which is fairly lean. But if I eat ground beef, that's actually quite fatty. Um, and actually, like for my evening meal tonight, I've made some stew with quite fatty meat, and that's one way where I can tolerate a bit more fat with my meat. Um, but I would generally eat like quite lean meat and vegetables, if depending on whether or not it's like keto or carnivore, and then just the dairy to add the fat. And so even
Okay.
on a carnivore diet, I would eat like meat and eggs, but I'd still have dairy because I can't seem to I just don't want to eat like a massive round of fat. I just don't like it.
Mm, I'm the opposite. I love a good ribeye. I'll take a ribeye over a New York
Hmm.
any day. Yeah, cooked in butter.
That should make it a little bit easier to adhere to. Yeah.
Do you intentionally cap your protein? I know that's an ongoing debate in the keto world, is some people think that if you have too much protein, that kicks off gluconeogenesis and your body converts some of the protein to carbohydrate and it keeps you out of ketosis and then you're not really getting the benefit. Other people have said, well, if you drop your protein down just in the name of upping your ketones, you're more likely to lose muscle mass or have, have a hard time in the gym getting
Mm.
benefit from your training and things along those lines. Do you
Hmm.
lean one way or the other on that?
I've straight in the middle, neither extreme.
Okay.
So I think I've often found that if I eat too much, if I eat a lot of protein, I actually often feel hungrier,
Mm,
and I don't quite have that um, satiety advantage that comes with a very low carb diet, where I just stop thinking about food and don't feel hungry, but feel like I've got very steady energy supply. To me, like the most powerful marker that a ketogenic diet is going well for you is if you have that just absolutely steady energy supply, regardless of whether you've eaten or not. So when in times where I've been doing quite a strict keto diet, I've been times where I can go out and do like a massive winter day, expending a very large amount of energy, but not take any food with me, and just feel absolutely fine all day and not tired at the end of the day and
mm,
not hungry at the end of the day. I was like, if I sit down to a meal, I can eat, but it's not like I'm going to really struggle to do another pitch here without
mm.
having some food first. That just
Yeah.
doesn't happen. Um, so yeah, that's the kind of hallmark of when I would feel good on the diet. So I find that if I eat really a lot of protein, I don't get that, and I start to feel more hungry, and I'm on that slight more energy roller coaster.
Mm,
But I certainly wouldn't want to eat too little protein either. But not, I don't think I would worry too much in a ketogenic diet about. I mean, maybe if you were trying to be a bodybuilder, it wouldn't be optimal. So to maximize pure muscle growth, a very low protein ketogenic diet is not optimal. So a keto diet is maybe not like super anabolic to muscle mass, but it is very anti-catabolic.
mm.
So I don't think you're going to lose a lot of muscle. And as a climber, I'm not really interested in gaining a lot of muscle anyway. So I don't think I really need to have masses of protein. So I tend to be smack bang in the middle. Although what I would consider in the middle might other people might consider quite a lot. So that would be like between 100 to 150 grams of protein a day.
Okay.
So some people think of that as being like a lot.
Right. So, and you weigh like 145 or 150 or something like that?
Oh,
Oh, you do it in stone. Who knows?
still or kilos. Yeah, I'm about 66, 67 kilos, something like that.
I'll do the math real quick. Let's
It's
see here.
2.2, isn't it, to a kilo?
So 67 would be 147 pounds. So yeah. So yeah, like maybe like zero point 0.7 to 1 gram of protein per pound body weight per day, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. That's that's a good amount.
I think that the main thing is that the whatever dietary approach you have, that it's giving you enough energy to do what you want and to feel like you've got a lot of energy. Um, but not so much that you're either hungry, you're either hungry and losing weight, or hungry and gaining weight.
Mm. Hungry and gaining weight
So
is the worst. That sucks.
yeah, and I spent most of my adult life in that situation, like,
Mm,
and I talk about that in my book as well, because that drove me nuts in my 20s and my teens,
sure.
where
Yeah.
I didn't understand because I had this paradigm where I was like, well, weight, weight control, you're controlling your body fat percentage, your body composition is like a primarily voluntary thing where it's like energy in, energy out. And if I'm gaining weight, I'm eating an excess over and above my needs. That's like greed. Um, but you would think that as your fat mass increases, your hunger would decrease a bit. But it made no difference. Like
Mm,
I was just as hungry if I was like trying to calorie restrict and be like really lean, or whether I was like really quite significantly over fat.
mm.
And I just didn't know what to make sense of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that observation I remember making was that I remember doing a wee fast like for a few days when I was 16. Um, and I had this, although I was like hungry while I was fasting, I remember getting to like the third day of fasting and being thinking, this is totally weird. I'm hungry, but I'm less hungry than I normally am,
Mm,
like mid-morning. Why is that? And I could make no sense of that at the time. Now I would say that my appetite was a kind of dysregulated by a Western diet, and or
sure.
I was on that energy roller coaster of having suboptimal fat burning, not
Hmm.
really burning a lot of fat, and so like really heavily dependent on glucose. So just your body's like an hour or two after having its last dose of glucose, it's needing its next dose, otherwise energy is crashing. And that's still the case for a lot of people.
Why
And
why did you do
that's
a 3-day fast when you were 16?
I was overweight, and
Okay.
I was trying to finish projects, and I knew I was overweight, and I knew that if I was a couple of pounds lighter, I would get further on the projects. And it worked in the short term. I did a 3-day, 4-day fast, 4-day fast, and finished the climb I was trying at the time, and then regained all of that weight straight away, and
Mm,
kept on adding more after that.
mm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, the ricochet or the rebound effect is very real.
yeah,
Do you, if you're having like a 3-hour bouldering session or 3-hour climbing session where you're bouldering for an hour, doing some hangboarding, and then doing endurance circuits, however long that is, do you eat during that? And if
no.
you're on a keto diet doing your kind of default thing, what do you eat during a session, if anything?
I never eat when I'm training at all.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd maybe drink some tea just because I want to drink tea, but I never eat anything. Just don't need to. The only time I need to eat during training is if I'm doing a high carb diet, and then I have the energy roller coaster,
Mm,
and then I'll do if I do like 2 hours training, I need to snack in order to do another 2 hours.
hmm.
But on a low carb diet, um, I just it's not necessary. Just run happily on the fat.
Same
Um,
thing with a long outdoor bouldering session.
Long outdoor bouldering session, like since I started low carb diets, as long as I've been following them, I never take food to the crag now. I just don't, even if I go out all day. Occasionally, if I go like for like a full day from early in the morning till late at night, I would take like 2 eggs with me. But that's more for just the comforting feeling of stopping for lunch.
Mm.
It's not really because um, I need to have the energy to complete the day. So if I don't take that, it makes absolutely no difference
Mm.
in the context of the keto diet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
And I've tried pushing that to extremes, and that's been quite interesting actually, because um, for either sport climbing, winter climbing, or bouldering, I've also experimented with just not eating that day at all and just fasting and having the day. And the winter climbing, like doing a mixed route, a hard mixed route, it's very physical and you really do burn through a lot of energy. It's like whole body climbing, and you're just like whacking to clear rime and ice off things and beating the hell out of everything for just hours and hours and hours. And I've tried just not having breakfast and just completing that day, and it's absolutely fine. And usually I find that I feel better as the day goes on, and that's probably as like fat burning just ramps up and ramps up and ramps up, and I just tend to feel better.
Mm.
However, the caveat is that if I do that for too long, it doesn't work.
Right.
So uh,
You have to have
then
food
you
at
just
some
run
point.
into underfueling.
Yeah.
So even on the keto diet, you can still underfuel. So you can get away with, you know, half a day of not eating. You're happily burning away fat. That's fine. But I've found that in the past, when um, I've done like quite a calorie restricted keto diet and then had like a couple of days of fasting and then gone on a big sport climbing day or something, I've actually bonked at the end of
Mm.
the day. And that's the only time I've ever been able to bonk on a keto diet is when I've stacked like fasting plus calorie restriction plus hard climbing for many hours. The
Hmm.
three together, then you can run into problems. So it's not like magic, but yeah.
Yeah. Ah, what else we got? How are you feeling? We've been going for a long
Oh,
time
fine.
here.
Yeah. Yeah. You were going to ask about LDL. I'm
Let's
curious
talk
what your
about,
question is about that.
well, yeah, let's do that. Let's talk about LDL and then we'll dive into listener questions and wrap up here.
Cool.
Um, so yeah, in our last conversation, this is a year and a half ago. This is the one that's available on Patreon. It's a follow-up. We talked about LDL pretty extensively and um, yeah, touched on it, a couple different times, just kind of teasing out like there's a lot of research coming out that LDL is probably not causal of atherosclerosis. It's obviously correlated in a lot of cases, but it might not be the thing that's causing it. The analogy that I often hear is it's like having a lot of firefighters present at a scene.
Hmm.
Well, okay, if there's a fire, there's going to be a lot of firefighters, but the firefighters didn't cause the fire. Um, but it's interesting. I mean, it's complex. There's different, um, genetic predispositions for hypercholesterol.
Hypercholesterolemia.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. I always struggle with that one. There's that. There's lean mass hyper-responders, which is really interesting. I think I might be one of those people. Like when I was
Hmm.
keto, I was really, really lean, but my LDL was elevated. Wasn't sure if
Hmm.
that was something I should be worried about. So we talked about all this stuff and just kind of, gave the caveats, but just kind of had a discussion around it. And then sometime after that, a few months after that, you sent me a really interesting YouTube video and a study. I'm looking at it here. So this is from Dave Feldman's Instagram, and it was Dr. Matt Budoff
Hmm.
presenting new data
Yeah.
about a study on ketogenic people who had high LDL cholesterol after almost 5 years, with no difference versus the control group in their plaques, in their
Hmm.
calcium score, and things like that, which is really interesting. Um, so yeah, I guess I'm just curious where you kind of stand these days on LDL, if that's something you're concerned about at all. Um, and furthermore, your thoughts on who should be concerned about it, because this is one of those, areas where people hear me say like, "Oh yeah, it's not causal. It might not be that big of a deal," and then they run away with it and think that LDL doesn't matter ever, no matter who you are. But
Yeah,
if you're insulin resistant and pre-diabetic and have other health markers that aren't looking great, then LDL on top of that probably is not a great thing.
yeah,
So anyway, yeah, just curious how your thoughts on that have evolved and if you have any new realizations or any new thoughts since our last
yeah.
conversation.
I mean, it's a difficult question because the data is incomplete, and if anything, the study that I sent you, which was co-authored by Dave Feldman, Dave Feldman's work has been really interesting in actually opening another layer of understanding of lipoproteins and cholesterol transport in the body and like what it's doing and what's going on when things are going wrong and what the process of heart disease progression is, why it's happening. So if anything, um, the more research that's coming out at the moment is making me feel less certain and less like I have solid answers rather than more. Um, and the other thing I would start off by saying is I'm not a lipidologist, I'm not a cardiologist. However, like you, I need to every day make decisions about what to do about my own cholesterol levels, whether to be concerned about them, whether to think I should lower them or raise them. And it's not straightforward. One thing I keep coming back to is that there is um, just, you always like look at the science in its different layers, all the different types of research, and often people will start with the epidemiology to figure out what's going on. And one thing I keep coming back to is that the mortality curves for like when people die with different levels of LDL, and in several independent studies from different countries by different researchers, there's a mortality curve that seems to center about 140-ish,
Hmm.
between 130 and 160 or something like that. And in different studies, it's slightly different, but it's quite a wide band. So going up to like 200, LDL of 200, which many doctors would be like, oh my God, that's so high. But the mortality curves are really low in that broad range, and they kick up at either side. Um, there's there's a few, potential reasons for that, but I still think like if if LDL of 130, you mentioned 130, was a problem for everybody, the shape of that curve wouldn't look like that.
So you're
Um,
saying that at that center point, 130 or 140, that's where overall mortality is the lowest, like people
yeah,
are dying
people are
the
living
least,
living longest. Yeah, so
living
people
the
with
longest.
LDL of 140, 160, even 200 are living longer than people with LDL under 100,
Hmm.
and that's consistently seen in the epidemiology. And I find it difficult to square that with the idea that we all need to have an LDL of like 70 or something.
Hmm.
So that's the first thing that makes me a little bit cautious about wanting to lower LDL or even be worried about LDL at all.
Yeah.
Um, then that study that I sent you, um, Budoff and colleagues and Dave Feldman was one of the authors as well, looking at plaque progression in people who'd been on a ketogenic diet for a long time. Now that's just the start of a series of studies that they want to publish. I think they want to track that cohort over time. And there are some, like any study, there are some issues with it. No study's perfect. However, I still think that that data is interesting, that there was no relationship between LDL cholesterol and plaque progression in those people. And also, despite the fact that that cohort of so-called lean mass hyperresponders with very high LDL, like, up in the, I can't remember what, there's a cutoff like 200. I think it might have been 200,
Yeah. 190 or
or the
200. Yeah.
the
Hmm.
lower bound of cholesterol to be accepted into that cohort. So some people are up at like 300, 500, 600, really, really high levels of LDL. The fact that they've got no plaque progression over 5 years. Again, it's like another sort of chip in the idea that LDL is always bad for everyone.
Hmm.
So that's one side. Then the other side is, well, um, LDL does correlate, especially in the US, with heart disease and heart attacks. Um, However, that also goes hand in hand with a whole host of other markers of metabolic syndrome.
Right.
And this is where the LDL story gets controversial and interesting. Where what is it you're what is it you're looking at? What's causing the high LDL? So some people would say that the high LDL, regardless of what's causing it, is contributing to plaque development. Um, but another view would be to say, well, no, possibly it's metabolic syndrome is the problem here. Metabolic syndrome being, well, you go upstream from that and you get to insulin resistance, but the actual damage is probably done by high glucose in the blood and
Mm.
possibly other things as well, damaging the artery walls, constantly stripping off the glycocalyx, the little layer, the layer that allows the blood to flow smoothly in the arteries with very little friction. That gets stripped off very easily and exposes. They're basically like skin cells in the artery walls. But if you cut your skin, you get a scab that then grows and then falls off into space. But you can't have that in the artery. That's a blood clot. That's what causes a heart attack.
Mm.
So when the endothelium in the artery walls is damaged or stripped off, um, the scab that forms on the artery wall has to be absorbed internally into the artery wall. And if that damage is constantly occurring, then you can imagine there's just a scar that's building and building and building. That's atherosclerosis, that's heart disease.
Mm.
And when that plaque becomes really bad, thick, and then unstable, and a big bit breaks off, that's a heart attack. That's what
Mm.
kills most men
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
women as well. So the LDL, there's like big disagreement over what role the LDL plays in that, whether it's contributing to the plaque buildup or it's contributing to the plaque buildup because it's doing a job of trying to heal the
Mm.
damage.
Hmm.
Um, that's a debate that's slightly outside of my area of expertise. I'm very interested in it, but and I and I've read a lot of the research on it, but I don't really know exactly what to make of it, to be honest.
Yeah.
But what I can see is that people who have metabolic syndrome, they this tends to be people who don't exercise and get overweight and are stressed. They get insulin resistant. They're damaging their artery walls. They tend to have a profile where they have high LDL, but they also have high triglycerides and low HDL. And
Mm.
that paints a picture that's consistent with metabolic syndrome. These people get heart disease and heart attacks, and they tend to die early. Um, but the question is, if people have high LDL for a completely different reason, not because they have metabolic syndrome, but because they do something else, like they're very lean, or they eat a high fat, low carb diet, or some other reason, or they have familial hypercholesterolemia, um, then possibly the LDL is benign in that situation. Now, a lot of people point to familial hypercholesterolemia as being a piece of evidence that in support of LDL being damaging, because they say, well, yeah, people with FH, they do tend to get heart disease, but not all of them do. And also, people with FH also tend to have other genetic differences that go alongside the hypercholesterolemia. They tend to have differences in their blood clotting, and that may account for the difference in risk of heart attack. So it's a bit of a complex picture.
Yeah.
When it comes down to it, if my LDL was 130 I don't I don't think I would be worried about that. My LDL is not quite that high. It tends to sit between 110 to 120, which some people would say should be lowered. I have no intention to lower that. I'm not worried about that. I don't think I
Hmm.
would be at 130 either. However, if I ever had elevated and rising LDL, and I also had high triglycerides and low HDL, and maybe some other things like high CRP, a marker of inflammation, then I would think I'm getting generally sick. My metabolic health is going in the wrong direction. Then I would be concerned. But then my intervention would be to solve the metabolic syndrome. So people on carnivore diets, keto diets, they sometimes, but not always, have high LDL, but every other marker is conventionally good, if you like.
Yeah.
And I'm if I'm going to be forced to come down on a side, like my default position would be to say, I don't know whether that's a problem or not. No one does. We don't have the data yet. But if I've got to be forced to decide whether to intervene for my own health today, like what do I eat today? Do I leave that LDL as it is, or do I try and lower it? I don't think I would try and lower it
Yeah.
until I saw more evidence that it was risky.
Okay. Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. Um, yeah, I'm kind of fascinated by people that are willing to just take a drug that changes their, their physiology, um, without any sort of long-term testing, like I'm a fan of Peter Attia. I've listened to his podcast a lot. I've read a lot of his work. I think he's really smart, but I think it's fascinating that he just immediately like he looks at the epidemiology and has just come to the conclusion that squashing LDL, squashing ApoB no matter what, putting people on a statin anytime their LDL is even
Hmm.
slightly elevated, that's the way to go because there's so much correlation with heart
Yeah.
disease. But I
Yeah,
just have the
Peter
thought
Attia
of like,
seems all in on that notion of
right,
LDL being a problem and really needing to be minimized. And I've always found his position on it a bit perplexing, to be totally
right.
honest.
Like what else is it doing? I mean, it seems very clear to me at least that LDL cholesterol is doing other stuff. Older people that tend to live the longest, from the research I've seen, have elevated LDL, and
Hmm.
it's theorized that it might be protective against infections and
Infection, yeah.
maybe even cancer and other things. And so, yeah, it kind of goes back to like, what do you want to die from? None of us are making it out of this alive. So, do you want
Hmm.
to, be protected from dementia and Alzheimer's and infection, or do you want to have a slightly elevated risk of heart disease? Yeah,
Yeah,
and there's just so much we don't know. So
yeah.
I'm still
It's definitely worth trying to avoid heart disease, and it is a preventable condition on the whole. There are populations around the world where it is extremely rare. In fact, um, you know, thinking about eating diets that are rich in saturated fat and fruit, I some good research that you might like to read is on the Kitavan Islanders.
mm,
A researcher called Staffan Lindberg did a series of papers on documenting the health and diet of these Pacific Islanders on Kitava, and they they eat a very natural diet, or did eat a very natural diet, um, which has a lot of fruit, but they eat a lot of coconuts. So they actually a lot of saturated fat. I think their saturated fat intake was like 20% of calories, which is double
mm,
the recommendations in many Western countries. Um, and also, interestingly, I think it was three-quarters of the men smoked, and a high proportion of the women smoked as well. But heart disease and atherosclerosis was almost unheard of
mm.
in that population, which is really really interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So it is a preventable disease. So that's the Catavans. They just don't get heart disease apparently, or almost don't get it. Whereas um, in your country, and certainly in, Glasgow was like it was famous for being the worst city, I think, in Europe at one point in maybe the 1980s for heart attack deaths. And usually it was like a Glasgow man would get to 60 and then drop
Wow.
dead of a heart attack. Yeah.
Wow.
Severe atherosclerosis. Yeah.
What do you attribute that to? What's your best guess?
I don't know. I don't know. I actually there's a Scottish GP who's written a lot on heart disease on a blog, and he's written a couple of books. A guy called Malcolm Kendrick, and he talks a lot um about Glasgow as an example of like a somewhere that had really bad heart disease rates, and trying to characterize what the root causes were, whether to how you can tease apart the different things. And I don't think he can really tease them apart either. Whether it's like the combination of um, relentless, relentless, stressful jobs, low pay, uh, lack of access to sunshine, leisure time in the outdoors, poor diet, poor sleep, alcohol, smoking. Could be any of these.
Hmm.
So Malcolm Kendrick gives the analogy, which I quite liked, of uh, rust on your car. So he was saying like heart disease is a process, a process of damaging the artery walls, and it's a bit like chipping the paint on your car. So he's saying like, what does a stone chip and a can of beans have in common when it comes to rust? And it's like, well, if you are taking your shopping out of the car and you drop a can of beans on the bonnet, it chips the paintwork, and then that starts the rust process. And if a stone chip comes up from the car in front and hits your paintwork, that does the same thing. So you have all these disparate environmental aspects that all conspire. Wood smoke is another one. So cigarette smoke and wood smoke both damage arteries.
Hmm.
Lead from lead petrol damages arteries. So um, there's all these different disparate environmental exposures that all conspire on the same, converge on the same process, which is damaging the artery walls. High glucose, all these things. So it could be, for Glasgow, it could be any mix of them, and hard to tease apart which is the dominant one.
Hmm.
But very interesting that the Catavans had a very high smoking rate, but a very low cardiovascular disease rate.
Yeah.
That was quite remarkable. So you do see that where that it potentially is a route to understanding the disease process in more detail, because it tells you there's an exposure that only matters in a certain context. Um, so, I mean, we haven't mentioned this so far, but one of the interesting areas of research is in the seed oils. That's another hot topic in diet. Is like, are they dangerous? Are they safe? Very difficult to tease that apart. But one thing that's come out of the animal models, which is interesting, is that to get rats to die of in a research setting of alcohol related liver failure, you have to feed them linoleic acid as well. And
Ah,
in diets without linoleic acid, the liver seems to tolerate alcohol rather better.
wow.
And I remember seeing that as a paper title that I read, and it said linoleic acid is required to cause um, alcohol-induced liver failure. I thought,
Hmm.
oh, that's very interesting. Because I was always, that immediately made me think back to my Glasgow past. So my great uncle was a hard drinking, hard smoking man. He was a bricklayer, and he was alcoholic for 70, more than 70 years. And he made it to like his late 80s before he died. He actually was his alcoholism was so bad that he actually gave himself acute dementia and malnutrition. And he blinded himself, and he got taken into hospital, and he had to get parenteral nutrition in a drip to keep him alive.
Wow.
So he literally almost drank himself to death. And then the um, he got, you know, recovered his health, recovered his sight, recovered his marbles, and went back to the pub to drink some more. So he died when he was like 88 or something. But his son also died of alcohol-related liver failure at 55. And I
Mm.
always thought, what was the
What's the
difference
difference?
between the two of
Yeah.
them? And I wondered if other aspects of the Western diet
Mm.
in combination could damage the liver. So these are the sorts of things that are not quite teased out yet. And I think it's the same situation with LDL and heart disease, where there does seem to be a different context where people can have, or many different contexts where people can have elevated LDL who are otherwise healthy. And I just don't know whether that's a problem or not.
Mm. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see what we learn in the next decade or two. It's really encouraging how much, people like Dave Feldman who are really taking this on, like kind of taking this mantle on and just doing all this citizen experimentation and bringing in some really intelligent, credentialed people to help. And yeah, it makes me excited to see what we'll learn and what we'll find out in the years to come. And
Hmm.
hopefully it'll lead to long, happy, healthy lives with lots of climbing for everyone listening.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I hope so. Yeah. I mean, I sort of, I mean, I read research every day, and I flip between feeling really optimistic. I mean, this year I've got a list of papers that have been coming out that I always save, you know. I mean, I look through them and think, God, there's so many interesting papers that have come out, and you think, "God, there's a lot being found out that's quite interesting and is moving our understanding forward." And then other times I feel really cynical, and I think that a lot of the really interesting studies that need to be done just don't get done
Yeah.
because they won't result in a drug that makes billions of pounds.
Right. That's the dark
So
side of science.
yeah,
Yeah.
if there's a drug to be developed, then there's money behind it,
Yeah.
and that's sad. And like I say, that's one of the reasons why I think the political situation in the US is quite interesting at the moment, because there's some signs that that could be just turned on its head, if not turned on its head, at least shaken up.
Yeah.
And it could get worse, but
Yeah.
I think it needs to change anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I did an episode about the health crisis in America and our political situation. I don't know if you saw that. I got a bunch of
No, I
blowback.
didn't see
I
that.
got a
No.
bunch of blowback for it because I
Did
interviewed a
you?
Trump supporter because of it. But yeah, I'm a
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of Bobby Kennedy. I'm a Maha guy, Make America Healthy Again.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'm also really concerned about some things that could happen, like it's going into this last election, I really felt frustrated that I didn't have an option that I felt excited about. But I really was optimistic about RFK Jr. And yeah, I'm hopeful that him drawing attention to the health crisis in America and being willing to talk about it more openly. I hope it'll lead to positive change and a shift in the right direction. But there's plenty of things to be concerned about too, and it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out.
Yeah. I mean, the most promising aspect is the discussion of funding basic research that's
Yeah,
not to do with drug development. Just we need to understand like the process of heart disease, let's say, or how diabetes develops, or something like that, where it's just basic science. That if that becomes a priority again, then everyone will win, because people like Bobby Kennedy or Donald Trump or any of these people, they're politicians, they're not scientists. They will
yeah,
always get lots of things wrong. But if they fund proper science is going to get us closer to the right answers. And at the moment, science, because it's has been partially captured by big corporates,
yeah,
science is not functioning very well. So that's the most promising thing, is like if funding is allocated by governments to say, find out how heart disease works, that's and don't bother about drugs. Just here's the money to answer that question. Um, that's a good thing. That will move it forward.
yeah, yeah. I fully agree. Yeah, people criticize Bobby a lot, and it's totally valid. I mean, he's an environmental lawyer, not a scientist, and
Yeah,
I've seen him get a lot of the details wrong. But in my mind, he's asking the right questions. He's willing to stand up to big pharma and say, "We need to know more about this before we just start dishing out some of these drugs." And think about root cause a little bit differently. And so, yeah, hopefully he has, a position where he can defer to people who have the credentials and have the scientific background and will do the rigorous studies and get those
Yeah,
people in positions where they can do that research that's not paid for by big pharma companies.
yeah.
I'm
And the
hopeful.
scientists,
We'll
and
see.
hopefully the scientists defer to the raw data. That's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
to run the study to say, okay, let's continue or expand that study we were mentioning where we get people who have high LDL cholesterol, but for a different reason than metabolic syndrome. And let's either run a trial where we actually recruit people to go on a diet that will put them in that direction, or let's retrospectively look at them, but look at them properly in a big study that's well designed. And
yeah,
then, no one at that point, no one needs to be an expert. Like the data will just tell you
yeah,
whether
yeah.
it's safe or not. Yeah.
Well, Dave, I'm running out of time. I didn't think this would happen. I scheduled another call for 2 p.m. and I was like, surely 4 hours is long enough with Dave MacLeod, but here we are. So
There we
I
go.
think we're
Cool.
gonna have to wrap up here and save listener questions for another time. I know you're a
Yeah,
busy
no
guy,
problem.
but if you are open to it, I would love to schedule another chat and dive into some listener questions. No pressure, but
Yeah, no,
um,
that'd be cool. Yeah. Yeah, that's
okay.
fine.
Yeah, that'd be really fun. Let's plan on that. But in the meantime, I hope you all found that this last conversation interesting and helpful. Be sure to check out Dave's book. It is called Moving the Needle. It is available at his website, which I will link to in the show notes and right there in your podcast app. Dave, is there anything else you want to share with folks or leave with people before I let you go?
Not really. No, yeah. Keep making your podcast. It's really good.
I appreciate it. Thanks, man. It's always wonderful talking to you. I hope we get to continue this for a long time to come. Maybe
Good
I'll write a
stuff.
book. You've inspired me.
Do it. Yeah, you should. Yeah, I'll read it.
All right. Bye, everybody.